The Byzantine Empire of Greece. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 51 Cossack. Before returning to Greece, Otto requested to visit the Russian army, for which Nicholas I had his squire general arrange a military exercise. After a brief conversation, Otto learned that this squire general was also an excellent Cossack. In his previous life, his impression of the Cossacks was limited to their skill in warfare, coupled with the unique high combat power and mobility of the Russian light cavalry in Civilization VI. Curious about the Cossacks, Otto specifically asked the squire general many questions about them. The Cossacks had played a crucial role in the rise and expansion of the Russian Empire. Several centuries earlier, in the Middle Ages, the Cossacks had made an agreement with the Tsar. They paid no taxes, performed no corvée labor, and were not required to hand over spoils of war, enjoying numerous privileges. In exchange, the Cossacks were obligated to unconditionally answer the Tsar's call to fight for him whenever needed. Furthermore, aside from weapons, the Cossacks had to provide their own war horses, clothing, and other equipment for battle. Their primary income came from plunder. They followed the Tsar in various wars, raiding enemy forces, as well as nobles, wealthy merchants, and even commoners from opposing countries. From a young age, Cossacks learned horsemanship and combat skills, preparing them for battle. In a sense, they were trained from childhood to be professional unloyal warriors. As for military discipline, one shouldn't expect medieval armies to have any. Of course, when it comes to looting during wartime, the Cossacks were experts. Modern Cossacks are similar. They received training at home from a young age to prepare for joining the Tsar's Imperial Guard, which was also the most trusted force of each Tsar. Nicholas I specifically arranged for Otto to watch the Imperial Guard's drills, partly to demonstrate the strength of the Russian army and showcase the prowess of what he considered Europe's strongest army. After watching the exercise, Otto praised the Tsar's guards highly, saying that the Russian soldiers were brave and tenacious, truly deserving of being a strong European army, a quality the Greek army should learn from. Nicholas I was also satisfied with Otto's assessment, stating that the Russian army would certainly destroy the Ottoman Empire in the future, liberating the Slavs living there from infidelity. In Otto's view, while Nicholas I's guards were indeed highly motivated, brave, and well-trained, their tactics and equipment were somewhat outdated compared to the major European powers at the time. The most striking impression of the Russian army in the eyes of Europeans is not its bravery and skill in battle, but rather its sheer numbers. This has earned Russia nicknames such as European military police and Eastern European steamrollers. Many European elites even openly and contemptuously refer to the Russian army as the Tsar's grey livestock. But regardless of verbal disdain, the countries of Central and Western Europe now view Russia as a predator, cautiously watching Nicholas I's every move, fearing the continued expansion of Russian influence. Therefore, Otto's visit to St. Petersburg to discuss his marriage to Nicholas I's youngest daughter had already appeared on the desks of kings and dignitaries around the world. The British were the most concerned about this matter, and King William IV was furious upon hearing the news. Although Greece was a small country, its location on the Balkan Peninsula made it a target of contention among various powers, and a key element in the power struggle between Britain and the Russian Empire. During the Greek War of Independence, Britain reacted more quickly, being the first to recognize Greek independence and supporting the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire's encirclement, along with France. Russia also reacted swiftly, supporting Greece and even successfully sending its diplomat to Greece as a new president, thus regaining some ground. Until the assassination of the Greek president and Otto becoming king of Greece, a policy of goodwill towards Britain was implemented. Britain also valued its relationship with Otto, initially helping Greece reclaim Thessalonians and later returning the Ionian Islands to Greece as a gesture of goodwill. During Greece's 5-year plan, Britain provided substantial assistance in establishing steel mills and constructing railways. In return, Greece imported large quantities of machinery and coal from Britain, and many ministers in the Greek cabinet are now close to the British, resulting in a generally positive impression of the British among Greeks. Everything seemed perfect until Nicholas I chose to strengthen his ties with Otto through marriage, prompting William IV to berate Nicholas I for lacking martial virtue. After his initial anger subsided, William IV felt some regret. Queen Teresa had previously mentioned wanting Otto to marry her niece, Victoria. William IV himself had no legitimate heir, although he had several illegitimate children. The deaths of his legitimate children had always been a source of resentment for him. Furthermore, William IV had a long-standing feud with Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent. The shrewd and petty Duchess of Kent was power-hungry and longed for William IV's early death so that she could become regent and control the British government through her daughter's accession. William IV knew Otto was an exceptionally talented young man, but due to his conflict with the Duchess of Kent and his own jealousy, he used various means to sabotage this potential marriage. To his surprise, after being rejected, Otto actually became Nicholas I's son-in-law. However, by then, William IV knew it was too late for regrets. He summoned his new Prime Minister, Viscount Melbourne, to discuss how to handle the situation. Viscount Melbourne advised William IV, "Your Majesty, the marriage of Otto I to Nicholas I's daughter could indeed push Greece towards Russia. I think we should do something to make the Greeks understand that England holds the key to Greece's destiny. If we anger the young king, he might very well align himself entirely with Russia in a fit of rage. This is something we cannot ignore," William IV added, still somewhat hesitant. "There's no need to worry too much about that. From what I understand, King Otto, though young, is not a reckless or impulsive youth. On the contrary, he is a very shrewd and rational person. Precisely because he understands the importance of England to Greece, he proactively approached us even before becoming king. After becoming king, he has consistently followed in our footsteps. According to my speculation, his marriage to Nicholas I is likely a test and a sign of his dissatisfaction with us, especially since Her Highness Victoria just rejected his marriage proposal." At this point, Viscount Melbourne glanced cautiously at William IV. Knowing what William IV had done, "Let's not talk about the past. Now, what do you intend to do?" William IV paused, then continued. "Greece has been building railways on a large scale, and their steel industry has always relied on coal imports from us. I think Palmerston could discuss the price of coal exports with the Greek ambassador." In Viscount Melbourne's view, this was merely a small test and warning. If the Greeks were sensible, they would soon come forward to apologize. Greece's rapid development now largely depended on maritime trade, and Britain had many ways to make the Greeks submit. Chapter 52: The Army's Attempt to Expand. After concluding his trip to St. Petersburg, Otto returned to Greece before the Russian winter arrived, also taking the opportunity to inspect the nearly completed city of Athens. He finally disembarked at the port of Nafplio, where he also attended the launching ceremony of Greece's first domestically built steam warship. Currently, the Greek Navy, apart from 6 steam warships from Britain, consists mostly of sailing warships nearing obsolescence, many of which are over 10 years old. Given Greece's geographical situation, Greece could not afford to slack off in its naval development, so Otto invested heavily in naval construction from the very beginning. In addition to hiring outstanding naval officers from Britain and making the most of the purchased British warships to help train the Greek Navy, Otto also ordered the Royal Consortium to invest heavily in the shipbuilding industry. To date, the Royal Shipyards of Greece have 3 large shipyards in operation, employing a large number of designers and engineers from Britain and France to enhance Greece's shipbuilding capabilities. Previously, these shipyards mainly built large fishing and merchant ships to accumulate experience and cultivate more shipbuilding talent. At the same time, these shipyards learned from British shipyards, establishing rigorous shipbuilding regulations and applying more practical physics and mathematics to hull dimensions and masts to enhance the service life and sturdiness of the ships. By the end of 1834, having accumulated considerable experience in building large warships, Otto ordered the shipyards to begin attempting to build the latest naval warships under the guidance of British technicians. He did not attempt to build everything at once. Only one new warship was built initially, with the intention of using it and making immediate modifications if any problems were discovered. The new warship design was proposed by a French designer, drawing on the strengths of both British and French warships. It featured a more scientifically designed streamlined hull, a full load capacity of 5,450 tons, and a standard load of 120 guns. However, the initial design had a problem. The gun positions on the lower deck were too low, meaning the guns could only be used in calm seas. Following expert advice, Otto, noticing this issue, ordered design improvements, which were ultimately completed by British designers. The improved design reduced its size and simplified the hull, resulting in a shallower draft and thus resolving the gun position problem. Although the hull was reduced in size, the armament was not diminished, and unnecessary decorations were removed to lower costs, ultimately leading to the final design. After reviewing the design data of the new warship, and after some consideration, Otto decided to begin construction of an experimental battleship at the Nafplio shipyard. Standing on a high platform in the port of Nafplio, Otto watched the new warship being launched through binoculars, and then, under naval control, it began to sail, conducting a series of tests including acceleration and turning, and finally firing at a predetermined target. Otto didn't know much about naval warships, but seeing that Rear Admiral Lyris, who had repeatedly requested him to strengthen naval equipment, seemed quite satisfied with the warship's performance, he felt largely reassured. "The test results look good," Otto said to Rear Admiral Lyris. "What do you think of the new ship's performance? It seems to have met the predetermined requirements so far, but several more tests are needed to determine the warship's combat capabilities and seaworthiness under different conditions," the meticulous Rear Admiral Lyris replied cautiously. "However, even the best warship needs the right people to pilot it, otherwise it will only become a target for the enemy," Otto reminded him. "Please rest assured, Your Majesty, the Greek Navy has not relaxed its various training programs in recent years and will certainly not disappoint you," Admiral Lyris said. Otto also hoped that his annual investment in the Navy would not be in vain. In the past 2 years, although the Greek Navy had not added any new ships, the expenses for training were considerable. The annual consumption of coal and artillery shells alone exceeded the Army's budget. In this respect, the Navy truly lives up to its reputation as a privileged branch of the military. Its expenses are indeed high, especially after the addition of new ships, which will further increase naval spending. However, Otto decided that as long as the performance of the new warships met expectations, more and larger new warships would be started in the coming years to gradually replace the sailing warships still in service. Otto even planned to expand the current size of the Navy, increasing the number of naval combat personnel from 3,000 to 6,000, doubling the size, with logistics and other departments also to be expanded accordingly. Of course, he didn't say it outright. In his vision, the Navy could simply expand gradually over the next 5 years. While concerned about naval equipment, Otto didn't neglect his duties with the Army either, with intelligence agencies constantly gathering the latest equipment information from various countries. Just this year, France developed a new type of field gun, a lighter and more accurate 4-pounder. Austria, on the other hand, brought out the historically infamous suicide weapon, a cannon with a range and power far exceeding that of contemporary cannons of the same caliber. However, due to defects in cannon casting technology and the lack of better casting materials, the probability of this type of cannon exploding was as high as 20%. Upon learning this, Otto immediately ordered the intelligence department to ascertain as much information as possible about these new cannons, ideally obtaining the design blueprints. His engagement trip to Russia took more than 2 months. Although most political affairs were handled by the cabinet, there were still many decisions that required Otto's personal attention. At least regarding information from the guards and government forces, and important requests from the general staff, even Prime Minister Sanos had no authority to interfere, allowing him to firmly grasp the reins of power. After arriving in Greece, Otto established Army and Navy military academies. Specially recruited instructors from Britain, France, and Germany, and combining textbooks from various countries' military academies, a completely new curriculum was compiled to train qualified officers. Now, each full-ranking officer in Greece is also assigned 2 deputies. Furthermore, the ever-expanding large farms across the country require a sufficient number of officers, otherwise, the combat effectiveness of these militia cannot be guaranteed as required by Otto. Therefore, even with strengthened officer training and expanded promotion opportunities, the military still lacks sufficient officers, and the General Staff recommended that Otto expand the current military academy. Clearly, the military now realizes that things are different from the previous 2 years. Otto is intentionally strengthening the military recently, and therefore, following its instincts, it has begun to find ways to expand. Previously, when Otto expanded the artillery, the Army requested further expansion of other branches of the armed forces, but this was rejected by Otto. Understanding that Otto has no intention of large-scale expansion of the Army in the short term, the military has come up with another method, continuing to increase the number of officers. As long as the size of military academies expands, the number of officers will continue to increase, and there will always be opportunities to expand the army in the future. Chapter 53 Hidden Worries. Otto approved the request to expand the military academy because he knew one thing. Although Greece had maintained an astonishing pace of development since the 5-year plan was implemented in 1833, nearly 3 years later, its growth would likely peak in another 3 or 4 years. Greece, after all, was a small country with an area of less than 70,000 square kilometers. The targeted construction of the 5-year plan, coupled with the Royal Consortium's relentless investment, had allowed Greece to achieve in the past 3 years what would normally take more than a decade of development. However, this rapid development also brought significant hidden concerns to the Greek economy. Leaving aside the royal family's massive, cost-indiscriminate investment, Greece's rapid economic growth currently relies primarily on light industry, mainly textiles, winemaking, and food import processing. However, Greece's domestic market is small, and the development of these industries depends on external markets, competing with the industries of many powerful nations. For example, in textiles, a leader in light industry, the biggest competitor is now Britain. Austria is a major exporter of grain and processed food products in Europe, and French wines are world-renowned. When Otto became engaged to Alexandra Nikolaevna, Britain merely made a token warning, yet Otto was forced to send his foreign secretary on a special visit to Britain to emphasize the friendly relations between Greece and Britain, thus superficially restoring calm to the relationship. Otto and his cabinet were well aware that mishandling the situation would undoubtedly lead to British pressure on Greece in various ways, which would be devastating to the burgeoning Greek economy. Greece needed to find stable markets for its nascent light industry, but in this era of rampant trade protectionism, this proved extremely difficult. Otto's previous careful management of relations with various powers, maintaining friendly relations with different countries, was precisely to preserve these overseas markets. Even so, with Greece's development and the intensification of competition among the great powers in these industries, deeper conflicts will inevitably arise in the future. Therefore, Greece must find ways to expand outwards to secure a broader domestic market and ensure economic stability. Friedrich Lister, recently appointed as Otto's economic advisor, recognized this and spoke with Otto about it, leading Otto to decide to accelerate his plans for military development. "Your Majesty, Prime Minister Sanos has arrived and is waiting for you in the reception room," Natasha reported to Otto. Since one night late last year, Natasha had become one of Otto's attendants, specifically responsible for managing his food and daily life. Unlike a tutor, according to current European custom, to become a royal attendant, one needed high status and exceptional ability. This ability could be personal skill or family influence. Without power and background, it was impossible to become a royal attendant. If this had happened when Otto was a prince in Bavaria, Natasha's appointment would never have been approved. The nobility of that era placed great importance on status and wealth. Beauty was, in fact, the least important thing to them. Natasha was the daughter of a Polish nobleman in exile, but since the partition of Poland, Polish nobles had lost much of their influence in European aristocratic circles, or rather, they never had much influence to begin with. As for wealth, Natasha's parents and siblings were currently living with relatives, constantly at the mercy of their hosts. If her family were still wealthy, her parents wouldn't be in this situation. Fortunately, Greece was a newly formed nation, and apart from King Otto, there were practically no nobles, so the appointment received little opposition. However, after the appointment, gossip about Otto and Natasha became the talk of the town in Greece. In the eyes of most people in this era, having a mistress was not a shameful thing. In fact, it was generally believed that a man without a mistress was not a successful man. Because of the Greek people's support for Otto, Natasha was quite well known in Greece. "I'll be right there." Otto turned and looked Natasha over. She was wearing a plain-colored court dress, her ample bosom accentuated by the tight-fitting garment, making her extremely eye-catching. In her early 20s, she was at the peak of her beauty, tall, with fair skin and clear, bright brown eyes that immediately caught Otto's eye. Poland really is a place that produces beautiful women, Otto thought to himself, exchanging a few playful words with Natasha before walking together towards the reception room. Did His Majesty summon Prime Minister Sanos because of that explorer who just arrived in Nafplio yesterday? Natasha asked with a hint of curiosity. "I heard you spent quite a bit of money funding his expedition." As Otto's attendant, always by his side, Natasha naturally knew a great deal. It's just a necessary investment, Otto said casually, though a hint of anticipation lingered in his eyes. That's £200,000, no small sum anywhere, Natasha said. If I had that much money, I could buy a huge estate, and the annual output would be enough to live a comfortable life. Don't worry, Natasha, your dream will definitely come true. Otto understood what the girl was thinking. Ever since he returned from St. Petersburg, he had noticed that Natasha's mood was off, her vague fear and uncertainty about the future made her want to grasp onto something she could. This thought was nothing to Otto, and because of his age, he wouldn't be married for at least 8 years. By then, Natasha would have what she wanted. As they spoke, the two arrived at the corridor in front of the reception hall. Natasha walked a couple of steps slower, lagging behind Otto, her expression becoming solemn and serious. Symmetrically arranged on both sides of the corridor were portraits of Greek legends and figures, such as Helen of Troy and Prometheus, the fire stealer. Reaching the reception hall door, Natasha opened it, and Otto entered, casually greeting Prime Minister Thanos, who had just stood up upon hearing their voices. Sitting down on the sofa in the reception hall, a maid skillfully brought Otto a cup of tea. Compared to Indian black tea, I prefer tea from the Far Eastern Empire, Otto said, taking a sip. The products of the Far Eastern Empire are indeed fascinating, and many noblewomen are eager to acquire its silk embroidery. Prime Minister Thanos knew that Otto was a lover of Far Eastern culture and had collected many items from the Far Eastern Empire. The reason I asked you to take time out of your busy schedule to come here is because of some news I received yesterday. Otto leaned back slightly, resting his back on the sofa, and said in a relaxed tone, just yesterday, the expedition team I sponsored arrived in Nafplio by ship, partly to report to me on the progress of the expedition plan, and partly to take a break. Where did your Majesty's expedition team go? What did they find? Before this, Prime Minister Thanos really didn't know that Otto had sponsored an expedition team, so he asked while thinking to himself. There wasn't much of a monetary return, just some African wood carvings, but the logs and hand-drawn maps that Mr. Massaman and his team brought back are, in my opinion, the most valuable things. Chapter 54 Discussion on Colonies. As a prime minister, Thanos was quick-witted. Colonialism was a popular topic in this era, and he soon gleaned something from Otto's words. Does His Majesty intend to acquire colonies in Africa? That's the idea, Otto said. You've seen Mr. Lister's report recently. Although Greece is developing rapidly, its over-reliance on external markets poses a significant threat. Indeed, Greece needs its own, broader markets now. Prime Minister Thanos nodded, then frowned and said, but can those African natives afford our textiles? I've heard the climate there is hot, and many natives don't wear clothes at all. I've never considered selling our textiles to those natives, Otto said, picking up a piece of dessert. My plan is to occupy that land, then immigrate there, using our own people to develop it like we develop our own country, and finally make it our own. But that doesn't seem so easy, Thanos said after a moment's thought. I've heard the climate there is hot and disease-ridden, with a very high mortality rate among explorers. That's true, but disease problems can be prevented in various ways. Experts have found that many diseases can be prevented through strict hygiene practices, reducing their spread. For example, the nationwide campaign to not drink tap water and the health education campaigns are all for this purpose, and statistics show they're quite effective, aren't they? The domestic disease rate has decreased by 30%. If various sanitation measures can be implemented more thoroughly, even in Africa, it should have satisfactory results, Otto said. Greece's territory is too small, but the current international situation doesn't allow Greece to break through, so overseas colonization is currently the most suitable option for Greece. But doing so also faces many problems. First, our population is limited, and it's impossible to have large-scale immigration to Africa. The rampant diseases in Africa also fill the people with fear of Africa. Prime Minister Thanos thought for a moment and said, moreover, according to your Majesty's method of immigration, a lot of funds are needed, and the government doesn't have a spare budget right now. Has the expedition team discovered a gold mine there? That could attract a large number of people to go there voluntarily, which could also solve part of the funding problem. No gold mines have been found, but according to the data recorded by the exploration team, I've discovered that the land there is very suitable for cultivation, not only for food but also for various cash crops. But in that case, colonizing there would cost far more than regular colonization, Prime Minister Thanos said, frowning. it would be a complete loss. Indeed, it requires a huge initial investment, but sometimes to obtain huge profits, you must be willing to make huge investments. That's a basic principle of business. Otto emphasized to Sanos again, I don't intend to treat those occupied African lands as colonies, but rather to manage them like territories. Your Majesty should reconsider. Your plan is too risky, too expensive, and requires too much investment. We must also consider the local resistance. One wrong move and we could lose everything, Sanos said seriously. The cabinet will not approve such a costly plan either. I understand that the government is currently short of funds, Otto said with a smile. So I plan to turn that place into my royal territory first. Royal territory. Prime Minister Sanos was slightly taken aback. Europe has strict distinctions in the division of territory, and there is a difference between national and royal territories. Just like modern-day Britain. Hanover can still be considered British territory because it belongs to the Hanoverian title held by King William IV. However, during its administration, the British government had no control over Hanover's internal affairs. The British and Hanoverian governments were two separate bodies, both loyal to William IV. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne, William IV's British throne and the Hanoverian title would be inherited by his niece, Queen Victoria, and his fifth brother, the Duke of Cumberland, respectively. Hanover was therefore no longer considered British territory, as the Victorian lineage had no legal basis to inherit the title of King of Hanover and thus could not inherit the territory. Meanwhile, British colonies such as Canada and Australia were legally the domain of the British monarch, not of Britain itself. The British cabinet could only influence and manage these territories through appointed governors, royal orders, and economic measures. Strictly speaking, Greece itself belonged to Otto's royal domain, as Otto paid the Ottoman Empire over £4 million in the Treaty of London to purchase these Greek territories, a fact recognized by Britain, France, and Russia. Just as Canada and Australia operate under separate administrations, Otto, intending to transform Africa into a royal domain, would naturally appoint other administrators. The Greek government would have no jurisdiction over Africa and would not be responsible for its development. Strictly speaking, Africa is not part of Greece, but rather, like Greece, belongs to King Otto's domain. Therefore, the costs of developing the African colonies would fall solely on King Otto's shoulders if the Greek cabinet disagreed. Conversely, Otto's decision on how to dispose of these territories, whether by giving them away or selling them, would be legally unavoidable by the Greek government. Of course, the future remains to be seen. Prime Minister Thanos currently fails to see the value of Africa, believing Otto's development of the continent is a losing proposition, and is therefore unwilling to allow Greece to invest too much money and effort in it. Otto could force the cabinet to pass a resolution if he insisted, but in his view, it was unnecessary. Firstly, it would create conflict between himself and the cabinet, damaging his prestige. Secondly, Greece was currently undertaking a massive 5-year plan and genuinely couldn't afford colonization. Otto had anticipated Prime Minister Thanos's refusal before their discussions. To date, Britain and France have occupied vast undeveloped colonies globally, and their African colonies are relatively small in scale. Most of Africa is now largely undeveloped, and Portugal, a small country, actually holds the most colonies there. This is because colonizing Africa at that time was genuinely difficult. The local climate, and most importantly, various diseases, were the biggest obstacles. Otto's meeting with Prime Minister Sanos to discuss colonization was primarily to inform him of this situation and to request that the Greek government provide some assistance to the royal family in developing African territories. This could include cooperating with the royal family's propaganda and immigration efforts in Greece, and allocating personnel to participate in the management of future African colonies. Prime Minister Sanos did not refuse Otto's request, but he asked Otto not to allow excessive immigration from within Greece, as there were very few Greeks left in the country. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55 Goals. North Africa, separated from Europe only by the Mediterranean Sea, was developed very early. As early as 1,000 years ago, European states such as Phoenicia and Rome established rule there. However, the Sahara Desert hindered European expansion southward, so sub-Saharan Africa remained largely untouched by Europeans before the age of exploration. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the powerful Ottoman Empire rose to prominence, blocking the east-west trade routes. The Ottomans imposed roadblocks and exorbitant taxes and tolls, making already valuable Eastern goods even more expensive. Left with no other option, Europeans turned to the sea, seeking new sea routes to the east. Columbus's circumnavigation of the globe ushered in the age of exploration. Spain and Portugal were the first two nations to colonize the Americas, and then, through agreements, one ventured west and the other east, dominating colonial development during the age of exploration. Spain established vast colonies in North and Central America. After colonizing South America, Portugal established colonial outposts in southern Africa, India, and Oceania. Subsequently, Britain and France, with their growing national power, surpassed them, and after over a century of struggle, in addition to their own expansion, seized numerous colonies from the other two nations. Even Britain, after careful consideration, only chose the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, for its colony of southern Africa. This area was originally a Dutch colony, but during the French invasion of the Netherlands, Britain, as an ally, seized the opportunity to occupy it. The biggest obstacle preventing British and French colonization of southern Africa was its humid climate. While humidity might represent suitability for agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, it also provides a breeding ground for tropical diseases. Geographically, the equator passes through the middle of Africa, so temperatures in most parts of the continent remain above 20 degrees Celsius, making it ideal for mosquito breeding year-round. Malaria, dengue fever, and a host of other infectious diseases are transmitted to humans via mosquitoes. Many African countries in later generations were severely affected by malaria and other diseases. Besides low levels of medical care, the biggest problem was the rampant mosquito population. Therefore, up to this era, European colonies in Africa were mostly narrow coastal plains, and they dared not venture inland. Even at the end of the 19th century, most of the African continent, except for the coastal areas, remained shrouded in mystery for Europeans. The surge of European colonization of southern Africa occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was because medical technology had advanced further at that time, and effective treatments for tropical diseases had been discovered. Most importantly, with most of the world's known territories already occupied, European countries turned their attention to Africa, initiating a wave of colonial expansion. Major powers established colonies across the continent. Currently, the Portuguese hold the largest colonial empire in Africa, having established colonies in Angola and Mozambique for centuries. Next is the British Cape Colony, and France holds a small amount of land in West Africa. Other countries are largely negligible. While Portugal's colonies are vast, their administration is extremely crude, essentially controlling tribal conflicts and instigating unrest while reaping the benefits. Against this backdrop, Otto invested heavily, hiring personnel and forming over a dozen expeditions to explore the situation in southern Africa. Over the years, at great expense and with the loss of hundreds of lives, Otto collected invaluable data on Central and Southern Africa. His funding for the expeditions exceeded £200,000, with a total expenditure for each expedition approaching £300,000. Massimine's expedition had the most complete personnel, yielded the most results, and received the most funding and rewards. Relying on limited data from his previous life, Otto's expeditions primarily operated in the Congo region of West Africa and East Africa. His primary target was the Congo River Basin, likely the future Belgian Congo region. In his view, even if colonization failed, it would only result in some financial loss, which Otto could bear. But if it succeeded, he could gain resource-rich territories. Successful development could even allow them to industrialize before Germany, providing Greece with much-needed cheap raw materials and a market for their goods, thus enabling Greece to grow and prosper. Currently, the Congo River Basin is unclaimed, and virtually no one engages in exploration there. This is due to geographical factors. The Congo River has a large flow, and its lower reaches are wide and the current is calm, making it suitable for exploration by boat. However, after sailing inland for several dozen kilometers from the river mouth, one encounters the waterfall area of the lower Congo River. Because of a series of waterfalls, it was impossible to continue exploring inland using the convenient method of boat travel. It wasn't that no one tried. After the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1816, the London Geographical Society took notice of the Congo region and commissioned Navy Captain Tucker to explore inland by sailing ship. However, the expedition was again blocked by waterfalls and had to choose to traverse the falls on foot. Faced with a harsh inland environment, the entire 65-man expedition, including the accompanying experts and scholars, perished. For nearly 20 years afterward, and even to this day, Britain has not sent any more expeditions to the Congo River. In this era, the most convenient and cost-effective mode of transportation for colonies was sea transport. Because of the series of waterfalls on the Congo River, the British concluded that no matter how abundant the resources of the Congo River basin were, they were meaningless without waterways. As for spending enormous sums to build railways in the Congo River basin, the sheer cost was enough to deter all colonizers. Colonizers of this era primarily treated colonies with a core objective of plundering economic interests, draining them to fuel their own development. There was no reason for the homeland to provide financial support or aid to the colonies. Even if some construction was undertaken in the colonies, it was merely a pretext for even greater exploitation. The reaction of Prime Minister Santos reveals the mainstream European view of colonies at this time. At this time, the only valuable resources found in the Congo River basin were ivory and even the promising natural rubber, the true potential of which had not yet been realized. Therefore, developing the Congo River basin was seen by Europeans as a complete waste of resources. In the original timeline, it wasn't until 50 years later, when King Leopold II of Belgium made a firm decision and invested heavily in building a railway in the Congo River basin, that the inland regions of Congo were effectively developed. To recoup his investment quickly, Leopold II chose a strategy of extreme exploitation, resulting in the reduction of the local indigenous population by millions within just a few years. Even Europeans, who had traditionally treated the local indigenous people with disdain, were astonished by this. Otto, on the other hand, intended to treat the colony as his homeland and would naturally adopt a different strategy. Moreover, he now had an advantage over Leopold II in colonizing the Congo River basin. Chapter 56 The Value of the Congo Region. The Congo River basin was close to Portugal's Angolan colony, but at this time Portugal's colonial development in Africa was not yet extensive, especially since the Angolan colony had not yet extended to the south bank of the Congo River. Historically, the Portuguese Angolan colony nearly deprived Belgium of its access to the sea. It was only through the support of Britain and France at the Great Powers Conference that Belgium managed to gain a sea outlet on the north bank of the Congo River. At this time, Portugal's colonial empire in southern Africa was not yet so vast. Entering the 18th century, Portugal, due to its extremely small domestic territory, clearly fell behind in competition with other European powers, and its vast global colonial empire quickly began its decline. In 1807, Napoleon's French army conquered mainland Portugal, forcing the Portuguese royal family into exile in Brazil, where they established the Portuguese-Brazilian Alvaga Union. This significantly elevated Brazil's status within the Portuguese colonial system, making it a kingdom on par with mainland Portugal. The Brazilians suddenly realized their growing influence, and coupled with the weakening of the Portuguese monarchy, although the king was also a Portuguese prince, Brazil quickly showed signs of independence. In 1821, the Portuguese royal family returned to mainland Portugal, and Prince Pedro of Portugal became regent of Brazil. By this time, the calls for Brazilian independence were unstoppable, and Pedro was forced to declare independence the following year. Portugal thus lost its largest and most profitable colony. Left with no other option, Portugal, after internal discussions, finally decided to seek redress in Africa, focusing its efforts on developing the colonies of Angola and Mozambique. Prior to this, these two Portuguese colonies were not highly developed, merely occupying coastal areas and not expanding inland. Now, this policy completely changed, and Portugal began exploring inland expansion. However, limited by its population and its own strength, the first wave of armed conquest was not very successful. After initial victories, it was quickly counterattacked by inland African tribes, suffering heavy losses. Historically, due to its weak national strength and small population, the cost of personally capturing large numbers of slaves in Africa was too high, making Portugal less adept at colonial warfare and conquest. Their colonial policy leaned more towards a combination of soft and hard tactics, resorting to force only when deception failed. The establishment of Portuguese rule in Mozambique and Angola was a long process. Initially, Portugal cooperated with the indigenous chiefs, acquiring slaves to sell to the Americas. Simultaneously, the Kingdom of Portugal encouraged intermarriage between Portuguese and indigenous elites to influence them and strengthen its control over the colonies. As the Portuguese grew in power, they gradually transformed these chiefs, tribes, and kingdoms into vassal states. The current boundaries of Angola and Mozambique essentially represent the main sphere of activity for the indigenous tribes that had submitted to the Portuguese. Despite establishing colonies for centuries, the combined Portuguese population in these two colonies numbered only tens of thousands, demonstrating the crudeness of Portuguese governance. After this failure, Portugal abandoned armed colonization and instead relied on its more established methods. In the original historical accounts, over the next 50 years, the Portuguese successfully expanded the territory of both colonies significantly, particularly along the coast. The Angolan colony expanded northward to the south bank of the Congo River, almost depriving Belgian Congo of any access to the sea. However, Portugal, having recently suffered a setback in its inland conquests and still recovering its strength, lacked the capacity for further colonial expansion in the short term. In other words, the area around the banks of the Congo River is currently largely unclaimed land. Otto believes that the most valuable region in Congo at present lies precisely in the area stretching several dozen kilometers downstream. This land is suitable for cultivation. With proper development, it can grow both food and cash crops, fully capable of supporting a large population and thus strongly supporting further inland colonial development. With enough people, the Congo River basin can be further developed, and various cash crops can be cultivated to generate profits. When thinking of tropical cash crops, Otto immediately thinks of rubber. The most important aspect of the Second Industrial Revolution was the invention of the internal combustion engine, which gave rise to the automobile industry. Rubber is the main material for automobile tires. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the rapid development of the automobile industry led to a surge in rubber demand, causing rubber prices to rise continuously. According to Otto's knowledge, the Congo River Basin has abundant natural rubber plantations. With proper cultivation and transplantation, rubber plantations could be established in the Congolese interior. Rubber trees have very high environmental requirements, thriving in high temperatures, high humidity, calm winds, and fertile soil. They are not cold hardy and will suffer frost damage below 5 degrees Celsius. They require an average annual temperature of 26 to 27 degrees Celsius and can only grow and produce latex normally within a temperature range of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, due to its shallow roots and relatively fragile branches, it is poorly adapted to wind conditions and thrives best in deep, fertile, moist, and well-drained acidic sandy loam soils with an average annual rainfall of 1,150–2,500 millimeters. The Congo River Basin has abundant land of this type, ideal for large-scale rubber cultivation. At the same time, the Congo River Basin is home to a large number of African elephants, and their fine, white ivory handicrafts are highly sought after by nobles and merchants, maintaining consistently high prices. Besides rubber and ivory, Congo is also rich in various mineral resources, with copper reserves accounting for 15% of the world's total, demonstrating its abundant copper resources. Copper's role in the Second Industrial Revolution is undeniable. Electrification requires vast amounts of copper wire, and copper is essential for ship propellers, bullets, artillery shells, and even coin minting. Congo not only boasts abundant copper reserves but also high-grade copper ore. Although Otto doesn't know the exact locations of these mines, as long as the land is secured, prospecting teams can be deployed, and they will surely find them. I recall that Congo also has large diamond and gold mines, and is rich in uranium. It also has a good supply of other metals such as lead, manganese, zinc, tin, tungsten, lithium, platinum, and palladium. In short, possessing Congo guarantees a future supply of various raw materials needed for industry. Of course, developing the Congo River wouldn't be easy, as its upper and middle reaches are home to the world's second largest tropical rainforest, covering almost 48% of its basin. Even in the 21st century, tropical rainforest remains a no-go zone for human habitation and is not easily developed. Suitable areas for development lie outside the Congo rainforest. Otto plans to cultivate more food and cash crops, such as cocoa, sisal, sugarcane, and cotton, high-value tropical crops. Cotton can prevent Greece's textile industry from being dependent on others. Sisal has a wide range of uses. Cocoa can be used in chocolate and other food processing, and sugarcane can be used to make sugar. With this in mind, Otto retrieved the records sent by Massimond. The document detailed Masaman's expeditions and described extensive information about the geography, politics, economy, and customs of the Congo River Basin. Because the records were too tedious and complex, Otto summoned his intelligence chief, Bruno, and asked him to reorganize the information into tables. These tables were then distributed to the relevant officials as needed during the colonization campaign. Otto then summoned General Corentin Masaman. Chapter 57 Colonial Preparations. Masaman was a highly capable explorer. Otto offered him a generous annual salary of 1,000 British pounds, along with substantial bonuses, to hire him. Over the 4 years from 1831, Masaman recruited a group of outlaws, and together with experts and warriors sent by Otto, they conducted more than 6 expeditions through the Congo River Basin. 4 of these expeditions ventured deep into the Congo River Basin and the African interior, obtaining a wealth of valuable data, for which he received a reward of 15,000 British pounds from Otto. Masaman, now 35 years old, had a bronze complexion and piercing eyes from years of adventure. Upon seeing Otto, he bowed respectfully and said, "Great King Otto, thank you for summoning me." The two sat facing each other across the reception table. Otto smiled and said, "Mr. Masaman, I've summoned you here today to assign you a new task. But before that, I'd like to hear more about Africa, mainly about the local climate and customs, and how you communicate with the locals." "No problem," Masaman said. "Let me tell you more about the local situation first. The temperature in the Congo River Basin remains between 25 and 40 degrees Celsius year-round, so most of the local natives wear only clothes made of hay and leaves. They also have a simple currency, a copper bar, used for intertribal trade. We usually exchange small items for food from them." "Copper bars? It seems there are rich copper mines here." "Where exactly?" Otto asked. "I've recorded all of this in my logbook, as you requested, along with a simple map." Masaman wasn't particularly interested in copper mines, not gold mines. His focus was elsewhere. Elephants are everywhere there. I guarantee those ivory dealers would go crazy if they saw them. The locals, seeing we seemed to like ivory, traded a lot of ivory for a sharp steel knife of mine. I guess they took it from dead elephants. Looks like you've made quite a bit. Judging from his smug look, Otto knew Masaman had probably made a fortune. Just looking at his attire and decorations, he already surpassed many wealthy European merchants. "It's certainly a good place to make money, but it's also very dangerous," Masaman said. "There are many indigenous tribes there, which are very difficult to communicate with, and some even harbor malicious intentions, attacking our adventure team. If it weren't for the warriors His Majesty sent, we would probably have suffered heavy casualties. The worst thing there is the damned climate and diseases, hot, rainy, malaria, dysentery, and incessant mosquitoes, things that are best left unremembered. However, precisely because of this environment, there is never a shortage of food. The natives are very lazy, spending most of their time doing nothing except for a very short period of time gathering and hunting food." As the two were chatting animatedly, Natasha knocked on the door and entered, saying, "Your Majesty, General Corentin has arrived." "Let him in." "Your Majesty." Upon entering the reception room, General Corentin bowed and, at Otto's prompting, chose a seat next to the reception table. "General Corentin, what are your thoughts on colonization?" "Colonization brings wealth to a nation. The current strength of Britain is due to the substantial profits from its vast colonies." At this point, General Corentin's eyes lit up. "Does His Majesty also intend to expand colonies?" "Yes, that is the idea." Otto nodded slowly, then pointed to Masaman. "This Mr. Masaman is an explorer. Based on his explorations, I believe there is a place in southern Africa that is very suitable for colonization, so I plan to send the guards to establish a base there first. The guards are ready to serve His Majesty at any time." General Corentin stood up and gave a very solemn salute. "I've always believed in the loyalty and bravery of the guards, but in colonizing southern Africa, those primitive natives who don't even have decent melee weapons are nothing to worry about. The real enemies are the climate and the diseases prevalent there, so you'll need to undergo more rigorous hygiene training before you go. You can learn more about the situation there from Mr. Masaman during this time. He has extensive experience exploring southern Africa and will be accompanying you as an advisor." After introducing the two men and exchanging information about southern Africa, Otto instructed his intelligence chief to keep a close eye on Masaman after they left. The Congo colony was extremely important to Otto's colonial strategy, so he wouldn't allow its specifics to be revealed until it was firmly established. While Masamune was indeed talented and skilled in exploration, that didn't mean he was entirely trustworthy. If Masamune's expedition were made public, it would be enough to attract the attention of many interested colonists to Congo and even southern Africa. If you were to find another buyer and sell this information, it could potentially pique the interest of other countries in southern Africa prematurely. Therefore, until Masamune accompanied the army into southern Africa, Otto ensured that his every move was under his surveillance. Besides issuing this order, Otto made another decision that same day, to expand the guards. Although Otto said the African natives were not a concern, it wasn't unheard of for modern armies to be overthrown by natives. To establish stable rule as quickly as possible, Otto decided to make a bold move from the outset, rapidly expanding the colony's size, rather than, like most colonists today, starting with only a few hundred men to occupy a single outpost and gradually develop. Currently, the guards consisted of one division, a streamlined organization with only 2 infantry regiments and 3 independent artillery regiments. Otto decided to expand the guards division to 6 regiments, totaling 18,000 men, an increase of 12,000 men. After the troop expansion, the first batch of troops sent to Congo was tentatively set at 1 regiment, with further reinforcements to be added as needed. After Otto issued the order to expand the army, he found it difficult to recruit soldiers. It wasn't that Greeks were unwilling to serve, but rather that it would impact domestic development. With the addition of Thessaly and the Ionian Islands, Greece's population had just surpassed 1 million. However, due to the vigorous economic development of the past 2 years, most Greeks of working age had already entered farms and factories, with a smaller portion participating in road construction. Recruiting entirely from Greeks already engaged in agricultural and industrial production would likely hinder domestic economic development. Otto, troubled by this problem, began to solicit opinions. In response, Corinth suggested, "Your Majesty, I think we can recruit soldiers from the laborers currently building the road." Laborers? Otto was slightly taken aback. That's right. As far as I know. Because we've always had language training for our workers, quite a few of the foreign workers in our country now speak Greek. General Corinth had clearly been considering this for a long time and said directly, especially the road construction workers, they've already undergone considerable discipline training and are hardworking, making them excellent recruits. That's indeed a good idea. After thinking for a moment, Otto thought it was an excellent idea and immediately agreed. Okay, you arrange for someone to go to those road construction companies and recruit soldiers from their hired workers. They must know Greek. Furthermore, I can promise that once enlisted, the 5-year probationary period for naturalization can be shortened to 3 years. Chapter 58 Recruiting Immigrants. Besides the army, Otto also needed to prepare immigrants for the colonies, as he intended to treat them as his own. Sufficient immigrants were essential for the colonies to thrive. In his younger days, influenced by certain media outlets, Otto believed that Africa's poverty stemmed from Africans' laziness and reliance on the weather. However, as he grew older and gained access to more information, Otto realized this was only one aspect, and many other factors were at play. Before the arrival of colonists, the overall level of civilization on the African continent was low, especially in the isolated Central and Southern Africa, where hunting-based tribal societies were widespread. Unlike the tribes of the northern Mongolian steppes of the Far Eastern Empire, which, influenced by Central Plains culture, gradually developed feudal regimes, these tribes in southern Africa remain extremely primitive. To this day, the main enemies of the local indigenous people are primarily local wild animals and diseases. In contrast, North Africa, bordering Europe and Asia, has been influenced by European and Arab civilizations, and most areas have developed their own feudal civilizations, with a local population predominantly Caucasian. Today, apart from Ethiopia, which is considered an independent country, other parts of Africa, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, have all, whether actively or passively, become colonies or protectorates of European or Asian aggressors. Countries like Ethiopia, which have managed to maintain their independence, are extremely rare. Of course, Egypt still exists today, nominally a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. It would have been independent long ago had it not been for the obstruction of the great powers. European colonization in Central and Southern Africa completely destroyed the original tribal ecosystems, forcibly dragging the indigenous people into the modern social system. For modern Central and Southern Africans, tribal systems are already quite advanced. In Massimin's diary, Otto also discovered that in many parts of Africa, the most basic forms of society, families and villages, still existed in large numbers, essentially resembling prehistoric civilizations. It can be said that the starting point of African civilization was far lower than most people imagine. In the subsequent wave of colonization, faced with Western guns and cannons, they were forced to accept modern civilization. However, these indigenous people lacked experience in governing a country and had little historical experience in nation building to draw upon, resulting in a low starting point for civilization. Deep-rooted habits, coupled with the numerous problems created when the colonists were forced to leave, led to negative effects, causing continuous warfare in these African countries after independence, a situation that has persisted for centuries. Simply relying on local indigenous people to develop a colony was virtually impossible. Even if forced, it would require an enormous amount of time and energy, making it entirely unprofitable. Therefore, a large-scale influx of immigrants from Europe was necessary. But as mentioned earlier, Greece itself simply didn't have enough people, so Otto had to focus his efforts on other European countries and regions. After careful consideration, Otto decided to primarily recruit immigrants from the German region. In this day and age, Europeans are undoubtedly a high-quality workforce, as European countries are at the forefront of national development and education. Otto's status as a Bavarian prince could greatly assist in attracting immigrants from the German region, while also making management easier. In addition, immigrants from Austria, Italy, and other regions were also suitable choices. After careful consideration, Otto also designated the Far East as a source of high-quality immigrants, drawing upon experience from his previous life. As the feudal dynasty entered its final stages, the corrupt Qing government intensified its exploitation of the lower classes, leading to frequent disasters and countless refugees, which the ruler chose to ignore. The lives of the people in the Far Eastern Empire became increasingly difficult. Landless farmers often toiled tirelessly, their blood and sweat wasted, receiving no reward and inexplicably burdened with enormous debts. Landlords, in collusion with local officials, used various tricks to double the taxes levied by the court from the farmers. Even in years of plenty, ordinary farmers struggled to feed themselves. Natural disasters and man-made calamities brought countless families to their deaths. At such times, the only option was to flee, seeking refuge elsewhere. Except for a very few lucky ones, the rest were left to die in the wilderness. For those on the verge of despair, what does a little hardship matter as long as they have food to eat? For them, nothing else matters. This explains why the United States could easily recruit so many Chinese laborers from its Far Eastern empires, even knowing they would be crossing the ocean to build railroads in America. As for India, another populous nation, many in later generations know the true nature of this world power, a system of habitual laziness across all social classes, perhaps even worse than the indigenous people of Africa, in Otto's view. While the indigenous people of Africa have a bad reputation in later generations, compared to the passive coping mechanisms and realism formed by the long-standing caste system in India, at least their attitude towards life is optimistic and positive. People perceive Indians as lazy because, over thousands of years of the caste system, they have developed a habit of complacency, which has gradually become a national characteristic. For national development, realism is hardly a positive term, and given the Indian national character, Otto would not have been able to absorb Indian immigrants. To manage a colony as if it were one's homeland, a large influx of high-quality immigrants was needed. While European immigrants were indeed highly qualified, unless there were no other options, getting Europeans to go to Africa, a place perceived as teeming with wild beasts and poisonous insects, devoid of anything, was extremely difficult. Therefore, Otto estimated that the number of immigrants he could recruit in Europe would likely be insufficient to satisfy his ever-expanding expectations for the colonies. Therefore, Otto also planned to send a fleet to the Far East to try and recruit some immigrants from the region as a supplement. In Otto's view, the immigrants from the Far East were even of higher quality in terms of discipline and obedience. For over 1,000 years, the governments of various dynasties in the Far Eastern Empire had been extremely adept at organizing and mobilizing manpower to build roads and bridges, dig canals, and undertake large-scale projects. Over time, the people of the Far Eastern Empire developed excellent organization and obedience. Furthermore, historically, in the later stages of each dynasty, they faced a situation of overpopulation and limited land, leading to severe social infighting and making them world-renowned for their hard work and resilience. Even recruited people didn't require high wages, as happiness is relative. For now, as long as they have enough to eat, these Chinese can organize themselves to clear land. Perhaps the large farms in Africa will be even better than those in Europe. Even the most physically demanding tasks, like road and bridge construction, are planned to be done by the local natives. At the same time, to guard against future preferential treatment in the United States, Otto doesn't intend to use these natives long-term. At most, he'll utilize their labor in the early stages of development. After all, without modern engineering machinery, clearing land in the African colonies can only be done by manpower. Once the colonies have passed the most difficult phase and their reliance on manpower has decreased, he plans to send these people to the Americas, allowing them to become members of the chosen nation. Just then, plantations in the American South were expanding rapidly, and the locals welcomed this labor force. Otto avoided future risks. The plantation owners in the Americas got the labor they wanted, and the African natives became citizens of the world-renowned lighthouse nation, a win-win-win situation, with everyone having a bright future. Having been reborn for so many years, Otto had long since learned the realities of this era, and even saw things from a longer-term perspective. Driven by profit, he had no conscience when it came to those tribal natives. Chapter 59: A Bright Future. Is this it? General Narussus stood on the ship's side and said to Marciman beside him, looking at the wide river that flowed into the ocean not far away. Marciman nodded. That's right, this is the Congo River. The most suitable land for development and habitation is along its lower reaches. Currently, the Portuguese are trying to expand their influence northwards towards the south bank of the Congo. To seize land on the south bank, our best course of action is to establish a foothold there first, and then develop southwards as quickly as possible, expanding our sphere of influence as much as possible. In that case, let's establish a foothold here first. Let the advanced troops and engineers land, choose suitable locations to set up camp, and scout the surrounding area. Also, let the squadron sail south along the coastline, planting our flags along the shore to inform any Portuguese who might come here that this is Greek territory. There were many Hellenists in the Greek army, including Rear Admiral Lewis. Most of these Hellenists saw Ottoman as their primary target for expansion, wanting to reclaim the core territories once held by the Eastern Roman Empire, but were consistently suppressed by Otto due to practical factors. However, given the opportunity, these Hellenists would not overlook expansion in other directions. After the plan to establish colonies was announced, these Hellenists saw it as an opportunity, and General Lewis volunteered to lead the expedition, hoping to create more living space for Greece. The ship docked, and fully armed soldiers and engineers with tools disembarked and began their work. General Lewis led his flagship and several warships southward, steadily advancing at sea until he encountered Portuguese merchant ships and finally approached Luanda, the capital of the Portuguese colony in Angola. General Lewis's flagship was a state-of-the-art British steam-powered warship, its hundreds of heavy cannons astonishing the Portuguese in Luanda. Portuguese colonization in Luanda began as early as 1482. The Portuguese Diogo Cao had reached the Angolan coast. Finding it ideal for establishing a port, he landed and established a foothold, trading gold, ivory, and slaves, gradually expanding his territory to the surrounding areas. In 1576, the Portuguese explorer Diaz founded Luanda, establishing it as one of the earliest colonial outposts in southern Africa. Luanda was also a major transit point for Portugal's slave trade from West Africa to Brazil and other parts of South America. A century ago, the Angolan colony was formally established, and Luanda became its capital. However, even now, the Portuguese population in Luanda is only a few thousand. As the colonial capital, the Portuguese had their own warships in Luanda, but these were mostly antiques, some over 10 or even 20 years old. These sailing warships would likely be sunk by a single salvo from the Greek navy. Upon receiving this information, the Angolan governor, Dalman, immediately sent envoys to negotiate. In Governor Dalman's mind, Greece was merely a small Mediterranean country, a junior partner of Britain, roughly the same size as mainland Portugal. Unlike the Greeks, who could only reminisce about history, Portugal had at least been wealthy during the age of exploration, giving them a psychological advantage over the Greeks. However, the warships anchored outside the harbor made Governor Dalman wary. Under General Lewis's insistence, he finally agreed to send pilots to guide the warships into the port. As a natural deep-water port, Luanda's harbor area was spacious. 2,000 heavily armed soldiers disembarked from the ships and landed on the docks. Seeing this sizable Greek army, equipped with the latest weaponry, Governor Dalman's apprehension deepened. As a veteran colonizer, the Portuguese understood colonial warfare all too well. Over the past century, the Portuguese had suffered many defeats at the hands of the British and French, and even the independence of Brazil was partly due to the British's behind-the-scenes instigation. "May I ask your name?" Governor Dalman asked after their meeting. "You may call me Lieutenant General. I am a Rear Admiral in the Greek Navy." "And what is your purpose in coming to Luanda?" "It's just a barren port, with only a few small plantations and no particularly outstanding resources to develop," Governor Dalman continued. "Your Excellency, we Greeks have come in good faith. We have established a colonial outpost on the south bank of the Congo River. We are here to demarcate the spheres of influence among our colonies to avoid disputes, and we do not intend to threaten Portuguese rule in Angola." Dalman did not believe Lieutenant General's nonsense. Judging from his demeanor, although he made no threats, he was clearly aiming to sign a humiliating treaty. The land of southern Africa is not as idyllic as you might imagine. In fact, the inland areas are teeming with lions and wild beasts, outnumbering the human population. Our country has spent hundreds of years developing these colonies, and now they are losing vast sums of money every year. Your country has come from afar. You have probably chosen the wrong place. General Lucis didn't really think much of the Portuguese. As a Greek, he had his own pride, and with the navy and guards he had brought, he could easily conquer Angola. However, Otto didn't want to have too much conflict with the Portuguese at the very beginning of establishing the colony. Before his departure, he specifically gave instructions. Considering Otto's orders, General Lyris patiently said, "Your Excellency need not worry too much. To be honest, our main plan is to develop farms here, growing grains, cotton, cocoa, and the like to meet domestic needs. That's why we chose to establish a colony in the lower reaches of the Congo River. I'm not interested in what your country plans to do in the colony, but the lower reaches of the Congo River are not far from us. How can you guarantee that you won't harm our interests? Your Excellency, please rest assured. My purpose in coming here is to demarcate the spheres of influence between our two countries, to sign an agreement guaranteeing your country's rights to the lands you have already developed, and at the same time, we can cooperate. Because our land development involves driving away local wild animals and natives, especially the natives, whom we Greeks don't particularly value, we will certainly have to disperse and capture them on a large scale. A portion of the profits can be sold to your country at a favorable price, as we are not familiar with the slave trade. We have brought 5,000 troops and 30 warships of various types with us this time, and more will come later. I believe that only through joint development of Central and Southern Africa can we have a bright future." General Lyris exaggerates his strength, and his slightly threatening persuasion annoys General Dalman, but the effect is obvious. Thinking of the warships and soldiers the other side had brought, Governor Dalman quickly calmed down. "Lieutenant General, peaceful development between the two sides is also my pursuit. However, the matter of dividing the colonies is not something I, as a colonial governor, can decide. Therefore, I need some time to contact my country. Rest assured, Your Excellency, our Greek ambassador to Portugal is already negotiating with your country, and I believe we will soon have a result that satisfies both sides. Our troops have already established a camp in the Sahi region north of Luanda, preparing to expel and capture the local natives. I came here today to prevent either side from taking any irrational actions due to lack of understanding." Seeing that the other side was trying to stall, General Lyris gave them no chance. "After all, if anything unpleasant happens, I can only consider it a provocation against Greece and order my soldiers to fight back resolutely." Chapter 60 Portugal's Reaction. Thinking of the more than 2,000 well-equipped soldiers in the port, as well as the 5,000 army and naval warships that Lyris had mentioned, Dalman instantly understood Lyris's idea. General Lyris, the territory north of Luanda is Portuguese territory. But all I see are some indigenous tribes, not a single Portuguese. Lyris said, could it be that Governor Dalman's Portuguese are those indigenous people dressed in leaf robes? At this point, Governor Dalman was also having a headache. European pride prevented him from saying such a thing. Before he could think of a rebuttal, Lyris continued, instead of arguing here, let's take out a map and demarcate our respective territories. This way, we can avoid conflict to the greatest extent possible. At this point, the situation was against him, and Governor Dalman could only nod, knowing in his heart that the other side was definitely going to gain a great advantage this time. Colonies in this era were essentially just broad spheres of influence, lacking clear boundaries. The Angolan colony, though not yet at its future maximum size, still covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Within such a vast area, there were only about 30,000 Portuguese, averaging practically deserted for miles around. How could they possibly oversee everything? The Portuguese only occupied a few key strongholds in Angola, the rest was largely undeveloped. Currently, there is very little Portuguese activity in areas like Sewage north of Luanda, and this region, with its tropical savanna climate, is ideal for agriculture or establishing ranches and livestock. General Luiz's meeting was precisely to forcibly seize this suitable territory for development. After some negotiations, General Lurches successfully incorporated the regions of Sai and Uge, which would later belong to Angola, into the Greek Congo colony. After General Lurches left, Governor Dalman, feeling deeply frustrated and pained, vented his anger in his office and prepared to write to his country. Governor Dalman knew that regardless of whether General Lurches's claim of 5,000 infantry and over 30 warships was true, the men he had brought were far beyond the Angolan colony's capabilities, so he needed to appeal to his country for help. General Luizes was unaware that Governor Dalman had secretly reported him to the Portuguese government, and even if he had, he wouldn't have cared. His immediate priority was to quickly establish a foothold in the Sai region north of Luanda. For this colonization, Otto had sent a regiment of his guards, nearly half of his navy's warships, and numerous merchant ships carrying over 6,000 laborers and a large quantity of supplies. These laborers possessed considerable construction experience, sufficient for General Luizes to establish footholds on the south bank of the Congo River and in southern Sai. Furthermore, a second wave of immigrants would arrive in 3 months, consisting of a regiment of guards as backup, and impoverished farmers recruited by Otto from various countries. These farmers would first receive hygiene and disease prevention training in Greece, and would also be taught a few basic Greek phrases before being sent to the colonies. General Luizes was also responsible for preparing accommodations and supplies for these people according to the colonial plan and the actual situation. These immigrants came from diverse backgrounds, mostly from the underdeveloped southern regions of Central Europe, including Germany, Austria, and Italy. Most of these immigrants were lured in as families, and a total of 30,000 immigrants were planned to arrive in the coming year. The agricultural company also specially assigned agricultural experts, doctors, and language teachers to accompany them. After completing the relevant hygiene and basic military training, they would be sent to participate in the construction of the colonies. It can be said that Otto invested heavily in this immigration program. Before this, no European country had ever organized such a large-scale migration of immigrants to a colony for development purposes. The Portuguese colony in Angola had been developing for centuries, and the Portuguese population had dwindled. Once the first group arrived and established themselves, the Congolese colony was essentially established. Simultaneously, every year thereafter, Otto would have the Royal Consortium send immigrants and various supplies to the colony to quickly replenish its population and expand its size. On November 8, 1835, Greece received a diplomatic protest from Portugal, alleging that Greece had unjustifiably infringed upon Portuguese interests in the Angolan colony. In response to the Portuguese protests, the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs quickly took action, and negotiations soon began between the two sides regarding the border between the Congolese and Angolan colonies. Initially, the Portuguese demanded that the Greeks withdraw to the south bank of the Congo River and return the regions of Zaire and Uge. Greece, of course, could not agree, and the two sides engaged in a protracted wrangling, with no results for several months. This continued until more information from the Congolese colonies reached Portugal. During this time, the Governor-General of the Angolan colony, Dalman, was also actively involved, continuously sending people to gather information about the Congolese colonies. Under militarized control, these Portuguese officials were unable to obtain detailed information about the Congolese colonial outposts. However, the continuous influx of immigrants and the daily training of the guards gave Dalman a rough idea of the strength of the Congolese colony. It was then that the Portuguese discovered that the Greeks had deployed thousands of fully equipped regular troops in southern Africa, along with a large number of armed immigrants who had undergone basic military training. It seemed that suddenly, the Greeks' power in southern Africa had surpassed their own, which surprised the Portuguese and made them worry about the security of the Angolan colony. In fact, Portugal itself was also hesitant about formally launching a colonial war. Having lost Brazil, its largest colony, The Portuguese government's revenue had decreased significantly, and its recent expansion into the southern African interior had not been successful, leaving it with substantial debt. Portugal was experiencing a series of crises, and its government was internally unstable, embroiled in fierce infighting. Considering its pride as a former colonial power, Portugal initially leaned towards teaching the unruly Greeks a lesson. In the Portuguese mind, Greece was merely a small country that had only recently gained independence. The reason for choosing diplomatic maneuvering was that the Portuguese needed time to ascertain the true strength of the Congo colony before formulating a plan. However, when news arrived, the Portuguese government calculated that defeating the Greeks would require mobilizing a massive number of troops from its homeland, and even then, victory was not guaranteed. Not only would the cost be enormous, but even if they won, the benefits would be minimal, as the newly established Congo colony offered little in the way of financial gain. Anti-war factions within Portugal began to voice their opinions. They argued that with so much unclaimed land in southern Africa and the government facing financial difficulties, a costly and unprofitable war with the Greeks was completely unnecessary. The pro-war faction, however, believed that if the Greeks were not defeated now, they would gain a foothold and further threaten the Angolan colony. Both sides held firm to their positions and refused to yield. On February 25, 1836, Greece announced that, in order to support its colonial plans, both its navy and army would be expanded. The Greek army would be expanded to 2 regiments, while the navy would gradually expand over the next 5 years, completely phasing out sailing warships. According to the plan, by the end of 1838, the Greek navy would have 16 major warships of different classes, hundreds of other ships of various types, and a total combat force of 10,000 men. Chapter 61, Making Trouble for the Americans. This naval expansion even exceeded Otto's initial plans, but considering the future need to continue developing colonies in East Africa, he agreed. Correspondingly, the Greek army would also undergo a certain scale of expansion. The Portuguese, who had been closely following news from Greece, learned of the expansion immediately, especially the Greek naval expansion plan. Thinking of their own outdated sailing warships, even the pro-war faction became much quieter. Thus, after further diplomatic negotiations with Greece, and a period of heated debate, Greece and Portugal reached a final agreement on the demarcation of their southern African colonies. The Portuguese agreed to the colonial borders drawn by Greece, but the Greek colony of Congo was prohibited from expanding southward toward the Angolan colony. An agreement on the slave trade was also reached, with the Congo colony providing Angola with at least 2,000 slaves annually at a preferential price for 5 years. Other detailed terms were also stipulated, effectively ending the first colonial conflict between the two sides in southern Africa. The Portuguese reaction was a matter for later. After receiving news that General Lucis had already established a foothold in the Congo colony, Otto entrusted the mediation with the cabinet. Otto understood the true nature of this old colonial empire. Whatever choice the Portuguese made, he and the cabinet had corresponding plans. Otto was truly concerned about the situation on the North American continent, besides his real estate investments, and a major event that occurred in North America at the end of 1835. Until the first half of 1835, Texas was still Mexican territory, but in the latter half of the year, Americans overthrew Mexican rule in Texas. The methods the Americans used in Texas were simple, a strategy of gradual reduction of the Mexican population. Because Texas had a sparse population, Mexicans had always encouraged immigration, which gave Americans an opportunity. Americans began to immigrate to Texas in large numbers, gradually diluting the local Mexican population. The new American immigrants also constantly clashed with the local indigenous peoples and Mexicans over water and land. By the time the Mexican government realized something was wrong, Americans had already gained numerical superiority in Texas. To prevent the situation from worsening, the Mexican government was forced to enact a law prohibiting American immigration to Texas. However, due to Texas's vast territory and sparse population, especially along its borders, this Immigration Prohibition Act had no effect. At that time, plantations in the American South were highly profitable, and American immigrants, for their own benefit, ignored the Mexican government's ban on immigration and its early abolitionist policies, continuing to establish plantations and purchase enslaved Africans. The conflict between the two sides was irreconcilable and grew stronger over time. Finally, in the latter half of 1835, seeing the time was ripe, The United States, which had been preparing for this, began to incite Texas to declare independence. Mexico, of course, could not tolerate this, and the president decided to personally lead the army to quell the rebellion. In the original history, the Mexicans not only suffered heavy losses at the Alamo, but the Mexican president was also captured at the Battle of San Jacinto. Ultimately, the Americans in Texas successfully forced Mexico to sign a treaty recognizing Texas's independence, creating the most favorable conditions for the United States to annex Texas. This tactic was actually not much different from the U.S. takeover of Hawaii. Decades later in history, the Americans also used the same method of exchanging birds for cages, continuously immigrating to Hawaii, buying land there, and squeezing out the living space of the native inhabitants. After surpassing the local population in numbers, they launched a coup, ousted the Hawaiian king, and then, through a so-called referendum, brought Hawaii under their rule. Otto, as a reborn individual, knew the potential of the United States and had never relaxed his attention to it. Besides secretly plotting to profit from the economic crisis, Otto was constantly looking for ways to cause trouble for the United States and influence its development as much as possible. The Texas independence movement was, in Otto's eyes, a good opportunity. The historical records Otto had seen in his previous life only described this independence event in a few brief sentences. However, combining the intelligence gathered in North America, Otto believed that even though the United States far surpassed Mexico in military strength and social organization, it wasn't without the opportunity to inflict losses on the U.S. The key figures were Britain and France. Otto felt they couldn't be entirely indifferent to Texas, especially since Texas had previously been part of the French North American colonies. To support Mexico, Otto sold them a batch of arms at a relatively favorable price in early 1835. Simultaneously, he also arranged for agricultural companies to establish cotton plantations in Texas, thus infiltrating the American independence movement. Furthermore, the Royal Consortium established contact with Mexican President Santa Anna, allowing intelligence agents to provide him with crucial information about the Texans' independence movement in person at any time. They also placed military advisors by his side. President Santa Anna has a rich military background. He joined the Mexican War of Independence at a young age and became a national hero for his fierce resistance against the Spanish final counterattack, hailed as Mexico's savior. However, his limited political acumen prevented him from changing the factionalism and depleted treasury of Mexico. Especially after infiltrating the Texan independence movement, intelligence deduced from subtle clues that there were American spies among the Mexican president's entourage, or even within Mexico itself. This made Otto realize many things. The Mexican army was already lagging behind in equipment and training, and intelligence was only transparent to one side. No wonder the president suffered so badly in the later wars. However, in the short term, the intelligence department couldn't determine who the spy was. Or perhaps there were simply too many Mexican factions with ties to the Americans, so Otto could only have his intelligence personnel remind the Mexican president, hoping he would be more vigilant. Of course, Otto couldn't place his hopes on the Mexicans. Having gained a deeper understanding of the era, he knew how chaotic Mexico was, and that American financial groups were undoubtedly behind Texas's independence. Without other interference, even in a direct confrontation, the Mexicans would be the ones to suffer. Especially with a host of backstabbing forces. Besides providing some support to the Mexicans, he primarily focused his efforts on inciting Britain and France. As early as the beginning of 1835, many newspapers in London and Paris were frequently reporting on Texas, including some articles criticizing Americans, clearly exposing the American plot to annex Texas. Meanwhile, the report also described Texas as a highly valuable source of raw materials, and incidentally recalled the substantial profits that British and French colonies in North America had previously made, hoping to attract the attention of the French. To this end, it even subtly encouraged powerful figures in France. However, until January 1836, Otto found that the situation in Texas had not changed significantly from previous history. In the latter half of 1835, the Texas independence movement, with American assistance, launched a War of Independence. The long-planned independence movement initially acted with overwhelming force. On September 27, they captured Gonzales without bloodshed. On October 2, they besieged San Antonio. 2 months later, they captured San Antonio, and on October 21, they annihilated all the Mexican garrison in Goliath. Before 1836 even began, Texas was completely occupied by the independence forces. At this time, Mexico had just assembled an army of 8,000 men to quell the rebellion in Texas. Besides the independence forces in Texas, they also faced the volunteer army that had come from the United States. Tipped off by intelligence agents planted by Otto, Tassin mobilized the local enslaved population during his advance, promising them freedom. He also contacted local indigenous tribes, assuring them that they would be treated fairly if they obeyed Mexican law. However, the indigenous people, already deceived by the Americans many times before, did not easily believe him. Only after Tassin provided them with weapons did they agree to guerrilla warfare against the Americans, as a form of retaliation. The enslaved population, on the other hand, were more enthusiastic, with most expressing their support and some even willing to join his army. Meanwhile, the independence movement split into several factions, most of whose leaders were local plantation chiefs, and these factions were in competition with each other. Fueled by intelligence agents, significant divisions emerged, leading them to choose to fight independently. At the same time, under Otto's instigation, European public opinion had overwhelmingly sided with Mexico. Britain and France, for their own purposes, supported Mexico, defining the Texans' independence movement as rebels. At this point, the U.S. president wanted Andrew Jackson to intervene militarily, but due to immense international pressure, the U.S. Congress was forced to adopt a policy of neutrality, stating that it would not interfere in Mexico's internal war. Privately, however, the Second Bank of America approved a $2 million loan, and many local officials in the United States openly supported Texas, trading arms and food with the Texan separatist forces. They even incited officers and soldiers to retire early and join the Texan separatist forces as volunteers. In Europe, after public condemnation, Britain and France took no concrete action. Only the French, after careful consideration, provided a batch of loans to a bankrupt Mexico after the start of the war, but with very harsh conditions. Otto saw through the French intentions and comfortably began to watch the drama unfold. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62: The Changing Course of the War. In Otto's view, the war in Texas was essentially a contest of who was the worst. The U.S. Army had never been particularly strong compared to European armies. Its only notable strength in both world wars was its excellent logistics. The Texan separatists and the American volunteers were poorly equipped and organized, even plagued by internal conflicts. But the Mexican army, their adversary, was even more disappointing. Not only were their weapons outdated, but their fighting spirit was extremely low. Desertion was a persistent problem within the Mexican army, one that even Tassin himself could not prevent. Fortunately, Otto's efforts were not without effect, bringing additional benefits. Because the war successfully drew the attention of Britain and France, they subconsciously overlooked the conflict between Greece and Portugal in their southern African colonies. In the eyes of the colonizers, Central and Southern Africa was essentially a wasteland. The British, in particular, had previously sent expeditions to the Congo region, which resulted in heavy casualties, leading them to believe that Southern Africa had very little value for development. The British viewed the conflict between Greece and Portugal over southern African territory with a sense of amusement. The British Prime Minister even privately mocked, "Greece and Portugal are like two starving beggars, fighting over a bone that's fallen to the ground." Otto was more than happy with this outcome. From Greece's perspective, the later the major powers noticed the colonial potential of southern Africa, the better, as this would allow Greece to seize more benefits during this precious window of opportunity. Because of this, Britain didn't react much to Greece's military expansion, which relieved Otto. It's not fair to say Otto was overly sensitive. After all, the original owner's loss of the Greek throne was largely due to the British. During the Crimean War, seeing Russia and the Ottomans locked in fierce combat, Greek nationalists saw an opportunity and clamored to join the war, hoping to reclaim their former Greek territories from the Ottomans. Pressured by domestic public opinion, and also driven by a desire to expand his territory and enhance his prestige, the original author ordered the mobilization of his army, preparing for war against the Ottoman Empire. However, this was met with opposition from Britain and France. Their ambassadors appeared in Athens, sternly condemning the original author's actions and even dispatching fleets to assemble in the eastern Mediterranean. Forced by British and French pressure, the original author had no choice but to compromise and cease his actions against the Ottoman Empire. This caused Otto's prestige to plummet, and the Greek people perceived him as weak and incompetent, exacerbating internal conflicts. Opposition forces within Greece seized the opportunity to amass power, launching an uprising and driving him out of Greece. Otto's experience taught him a valuable lesson. Britain and France, especially Britain, were unwilling to see the situation in the Balkans change. If Greece launched a war against the Ottomans, it would inevitably face a British blockade and even war. However, the rise of Hellenistic sentiment within Greece, along with the spread of nationalism, persisted. Despite Otto's cautious approach and careful propaganda, nationalism continued to intensify unavoidably. He could suppress it temporarily, but not indefinitely. If he couldn't meet the people's demands, his fate wouldn't be any better than his predecessors. The unprovoked expansion of the military inevitably alerted Britain before Greece was fully prepared. After all, the enmity between Greece and the Ottomans had been established during the Greek War of Independence, making them irreconcilable enemies. A hasty expansion of the military, with no need to guess its target, is likely to provoke British opposition. If Greece were to disregard British advice and proceed unilaterally, a British blockade of sea routes could plunge Greece into internal strife. It can be said that instigating conflict with Portugal over its colonies, coupled with inciting public opinion on Texas independence, artificially created a hotspot, with a hidden objective, to divert British attention and distract them from Greece's military expansion. Judging from the current outcome, the British attention has predictably been drawn, and with other matters to tend to, they have inevitably become less vigilant regarding Greece. Sure enough, giving the British something to do and causing some trouble for the Americans makes things easier, but that's not enough. Otto thought to himself. Otto's meddling in America wasn't without its costs. Worried that the booming American real estate industry would be affected by the Texas War, he instructed his investment teams in the U.S. to gradually withdraw their funds from American real estate. Meanwhile, to Otto's surprise, Tassinana's Mexican army achieved a series of victories, successfully capturing Goliath shortly after their advance. A glance at a map of Texas reveals that Goliath was the most important hub for land and water transportation. Whoever captured it controlled San Antonio, the then capital of Texas. San Antonio was not only the capital but also a crucial food base and economic center. In the ensuing battles, the Mexican army suffered considerable losses, but with the advice of military advisors sent by Otto, they achieved successive victories. Within 6 months, they captured key Texas cities one after another, eventually beginning the siege of Dallas, the last stronghold of the Texan separatists. The Mexican army's performance forced the United States to issue a diplomatic note demanding that Mexico cease its offensive. As expected, the proposal was rejected by the Mexicans. The U.S. ambassador then requested the purchase of Texas, but Mexican President Tassinana also firmly rejected this offer. Ultimately, the Americans had to resort to force, claiming that Mexican cavalry had crossed into U.S. territory during a pursuit, resulting in the disappearance of an American soldier, and demanding that Mexico cease its attacks on American civilians. After being rejected again, the prepared U.S. declared war on Mexico, sending 8,000 troops to Texas. Near Dallas, fierce fighting ensued, with the U.S. defeating an 800-strong Mexican vanguard and forcing a Mexican retreat. In August 1836, after the Mexican army retreated to Austin, they adopted a strategy of building fortifications and holding the ground, inflicting heavy losses on the 8,000-strong American army advancing on Texas, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, Otto was calculating his gains in America. To date, several of Otto's investment teams in the United States had successfully sold 40% of their land holdings, successfully cashing out a large sum of money, which was then exchanged for 4.7 million British pounds in cash and 2 million British pounds worth of precious metals on the London Stock Exchange. These gains were far from a 40-fold return, but a net return of nearly 17 times was enough to satisfy Otto, and more importantly, it alleviated his financial difficulties. Chapter 63 The New Nafplio. The enormous investment required for the colonization of Congo exceeded Otto's expectations and the calculations of the Royal Consortium. By July 1836, the £2 million Otto had originally set aside for the immigration plan had long been spent, even exceeding the budget by more than £400,000. At this time, everything in the Congo colony, from various agricultural tools needed by farmers to cultivate the land to daily necessities such as clothing for the immigrants, needed to be transported from Europe by the Royal Consortium. To ensure transport capacity, Otto also hired a large number of merchant ships to meet the needs of the Congo colony, since starting from scratch was the most difficult and costly step. If it weren't for this emergency income, Otto would most likely have chosen to continue diverting funds from the Royal Consortium to ensure the development of the colony, thus slowing down its progress. There were simply too many places to spend money. Even though the Royal Consortium owned several golden goose industries, Otto still felt financially strained, which made him understand why, to this day, the number of European colonists who have come to Africa to explore new frontiers is extremely limited. Therefore, the newly acquired funds quickly found a new purpose. The Royal Consortium first used £1.7 million to solve the funding problem for continued expansion. Of the remaining funds, £1 million was allocated to the Congo Colony Development Fund to cover future emergency expenditures, while £2 million in cash was used for new investment projects in North America. The final £2 million in precious metals was transported back to Greece and deposited in the Royal Bank of Greece, ready for minting currency. The Royal Bank of Greece and the National Bank of Greece are the only two banks in Greece with a right to mint coins, belonging to the Greek royal family and the Greek government, respectively. In recent years, with the rapid development of the Greek economy, deflation has also emerged, forcing some domestic transactions to use pounds sterling or francs. In later times, simply printing money would solve the problem, but this is not feasible. While paper money is indeed the future trend, metal currency is currently the mainstream in Europe. Especially for Greece, a small country without the credibility of major powers, and with its national bank holding relatively few precious metal reserves, issuing paper money rashly could easily backfire. Therefore, Greece still uses metal currency. This injection of precious metals into the Greek market can effectively alleviate Greece's deflation problem and reclaim some of the domestic currency market. At the same time, the Greek government can also obtain a sum of minting tax revenue, alleviating some of the military expenses for the army's expansion. Of course, Otto knew that this could only temporarily solve the problem. He hoped that his new investments in North America would bring in more gold, allowing Greece to have sufficient gold reserves, thereby completely resolving Greece's money shortage and completely squeezing other foreign currencies out of the domestic market. The first foothold established by the Greek colonial team in southern Africa was on the south bank of the Congo River. To commemorate this important location, General Liebers named it Novo Nafplio. The municipal district of Novo Nafplio is situated on the coastal plain on the south bank of the Congo River, less than 10 kilometers from the port area. Influenced by warm, humid air currents near the equator, the surrounding area is lush with vegetation. Due to the uneven distribution of rainfall in Africa, large amounts of rainwater accumulate in rivers during the rainy season, easily causing floods downstream. The Congo River is gentle and wide, and Novo Nafplio was built on a relatively high slope not far from the river. The lower reaches of the Congo River receive abundant rainfall, and due to its location near the equator, it enjoys ample sunshine and heat. Agricultural experts have confirmed that this region is suitable for growing crops such as rice, flax, and corn. Before the arrival of the Greek colonists, this area was a wilderness, inhabited only by a few indigenous tribes and a few wild animals. To protect against attacks from wild animals and scattered indigenous tribes, the Greek colonists dug trenches and built low fences around New Nafplio. The entire project was substantial, housing over 3,000 residents, along with a battalion of guards stationed nearby to oversee the 2,000 indigenous people assigned to the area. Although Otto tried his best to recruit immigrants as families, due to practical problems, a large portion of these residents from all over Europe were lured in under the guise of employment. In reality, they would spend the rest of their lives there, with little chance of returning to Europe. The agricultural company signed employment contracts for up to 20 years, and these migrant workers were all adults. They were essentially stuck working for Otto for life. However, with the future development of Congo, it is estimated that even if Otto asked them to leave, they would probably not want to return to their hometowns and resume a life of poverty. After docking in the port area, the immigrants were disembarked, and port staff who were already prepared disinfected them. They stripped naked and cleaned themselves with soap and water drawn from wooden buckets. Because of the hot weather, they didn't have to worry about catching a cold. Then they changed into issued uniforms, got haircuts and shaves, and lived in temporary shacks as families. After the cleaning was completed, these people, escorted by the army, went to the town area to begin land reclamation. The Guards regiment had already cleared the surrounding wild animals and indigenous tribes, and regular patrols were also arranged, making the area within 10 kilometers of the town safe. Most of the local indigenous people were driven away by the Guards' physical force. Those who resisted were simply captured and used as free labor. The reason not to capture them all was due to a shortage of manpower. Every person who had arrived in Congo was a valuable asset, and it wasn't worthwhile to directly confront the indigenous tribes. The moats surrounding the towns were all built by captured indigenous prisoners. Most of these indigenous people were now under the guard of the Guards, constructing gravel roads from the town area to the port area. Due to the labor shortage, these people were assigned to heavy manual labor such as road construction and canal digging, while also serving as substitutes for livestock and tilling the land in agricultural production. The land in the lower reaches of the Congo River is flat and open, and these immigrants didn't find it difficult to adapt. The only problem was the hot weather, but the intense sunlight was something these farmers, who toiled in the fields from dawn till dusk, could only somewhat overcome. The newly arrived immigrants primarily cultivated rice, but they didn't pursue high yields, they only needed to feed the colony. The remaining land was used to grow cash crops such as sisal and cotton. Cotton supplied the Greek textile industry. Its low price from the colony further reduced costs, promoting the development of the Greek textile industry. Sisal was a superior raw material for making ship cables, sacks, and felt. In the era of wooden boats, sisal's excellent properties gave it a huge market, and its value as a cash crop was still rising. Compared to growing food in the colony and shipping it to Europe, growing these cash crops meant that you could earn as much as you grew. After all, the Royal Consortium had large-scale food farms throughout Europe, and transporting the grain back to Greece was even cheaper. European countries also had their own food industries, where staple food production was low profit, high volume, and the profits were far less than those from cash crops. Sisal, in particular, was very suitable for the Congo colonies, as it could only be widely cultivated in tropical regions. The Congo colonies weren't entirely composed of rainforests that were difficult to cultivate, they also included tropical grasslands and desert climates. The tropical grassland climate of the lower Congo was ideal for sisal cultivation. The large number of cotton and other cash crop plantations in North America was also because plantations were more profitable than farms. The lower Congo River region boasts a favorable climate and vast land area, with a significant amount of arable land. While the exact potential for development remains unknown, Otto's past experiences have shown him that much of Congo is indeed suitable for agriculture. The only constraint on land development is water resources. The lack of irrigation facilities and reservoirs means that abundant rainfall flows into the Atlantic Ocean unused. Therefore, future colonies will undoubtedly need to undertake numerous water conservancy projects to effectively utilize the water resources of the lower Congo River and address agricultural development challenges. Chapter 64 Colonial Development. In Novo Nafplio, a colony in the Greek Congo, rows of newly planted sisal seedlings are growing in the southwestern area outside the town. Newly settled agricultural workers are tilling the soil according to the instructions of agricultural experts. Along the paths, natives can be seen pulling iron plows purchased from Europe, turning over the soil. European farmers are responsible for the soil around the sisal seedlings. This delicate work would damage the sisal roots if done by the natives, so it can only be done by European immigrants. Meanwhile, on the already completed land, hydraulic engineers are pointing and instructing, while guardsmen supervise the natives digging drainage ditches. A flat area not far away is being planted with rice, and new irrigation canals are under construction to ensure water supply. With the arrival of more and more immigrants, the scale of agriculture here has become quite considerable. New immigrants are assigned by the agricultural company to work under experienced farmers. The agricultural company provides management, while the guards are responsible for supervision and force, overseeing the indigenous labor, preventing attacks from unruly indigenous tribes, and regularly clearing the land around Nafplio. Taiwan Novel Network, a steady stream of immigrants were dispersed to areas dozens of kilometers around New Nafplion, establishing strongholds with hundreds or nearly 1,000 people. In the future, these strongholds will be transformed into villages or towns around the city of Nafplion. The large forces spread out to protect these strongholds, and at the same time several teams were arranged to continue exploring inland and draw detailed maps. I will also catch some indigenous laborers on my way back to contribute to the development of the colony. In addition to New Nafplion, the Congolese colonial team also established another colonial core site in the Say area to the south. The establishment of this colonial outpost was to secure the border region bordering the southern colony of Angola and to completely occupy the surrounding land. The Congo colony expanded at a visible pace, and a rudimentary colonial structure centered on the outposts of Novo Nafplio and Soyi had emerged on the south bank of the Congo River, with its main area of operation covering approximately 60,000 square kilometers. Once this area on the south bank of the Congo was stabilized, new outposts would continuously appear in the lower reaches of the Congo River, expanding eastward inland, provided that subsequent immigration could keep pace. Currently, Novo Karamé on the north bank of the Congo is under planning, and construction will begin once more personnel arrive. Novo Kalamé and Nova Nafplio, separated by the Congo River, will become key strongholds for colonial expansion on the north bank of the Congo. Sisal, native to the Mexican highlands, was discovered by Europeans during the Age of Exploration and spread throughout the world with the expansion of colonists. According to agricultural experts, Sisal thrives in warm, humid, and evenly distributed high-slope environments, ideally with high temperatures, dryness, and ample sunshine during the day, and fog and dew at night. It is also highly adaptable, tolerating poor soil and drought but susceptible to waterlogging, yet it is vigorous and adaptable to a wide range of conditions. It is best planted in loose, well-drained, fertile sandy loam soil with a low water table. Poorly drained and frequently damp areas are unsuitable for sisal cultivation. Furthermore, sisal has low cold tolerance and is prone to physiological leaf spot disease. Large tracts of land in the lower Congo River region are ideal for sisal cultivation, so Otto even brought in experienced farmers from Mexico. Although these individuals were not highly educated, they possessed extensive experience and were nominally workers for the agricultural company, but in reality, they were. The Congo colony was part of Otto's Greek royal domain, and Otto did not appoint a colonial governor. Under Otto's arrangement, agricultural companies were responsible for establishing and managing large farms throughout the region, while the Imperial Guard was responsible for the security of key locations and the colony. The two sides cooperated in developing the colony. In addition, Otto would station his trusted confidants and intelligence agents in rotation throughout the colonies to monitor the situation. They also served as another information channel, summarizing and reporting colonial intelligence to Otto to prevent any potential deception or misrepresentation due to the distance. Furthermore, at Otto's invitation, Bishop Eugene sent missionaries to the Congo colonies. These missionaries, besides preaching, also worked with teachers dispatched by the Royal Consortium to provide basic education to the colonists. Apart from a few core outposts under military control, the other outposts in the Congo colonies were centered around large farms, managed like corporations, with agricultural companies arranging collective labor for the agricultural workers. All immigrants were divided into different groups to systematically develop land in the lower Congo River region. Food rations and additional bonuses were determined by work efficiency. Agricultural companies had their own set of standards for managing large farms, evaluating the agricultural workers' work based on workload, time spent, quality of land development, and subsequent crop growth. In addition to food and 3 sets of uniforms per year, each large farm had a grocery store. These stores sold various goods imported from Europe to the farm workers, who could purchase them with their wages. If these farm workers wanted to save their wages, the Greek Royal Bank, with branches in key locations, would send staff every quarter, protected by guards, to these large farms to handle deposits and withdrawals. Through comparison, the agricultural company fully confirmed Otto's assertion that European immigrants were more efficient and easier to manage than the natives. The natives of southern Africa, on the other hand, mostly required supervision with whips to keep them from working lazily. Although there was an element of exploitation, compared to the European immigrants, the agricultural company's staff gradually understood Otto's instructions on how to deal with the natives. Due to colonial expansion, the animals on the lower Congo River grasslands could no longer roam freely as before. Large animals such as wildebeest and lions were hunted by the guards. The meat of these animals ended up in the stomachs of both the guard soldiers and the immigrants. After a period of relative stability, the immigrants had free time at night, and they began their only form of entertainment, increasing the colony's population. From the very beginning of immigrant recruitment, Otto instructed the Royal Consortium to prioritize family immigrants, as family formation was a crucial condition for maintaining stability and rule. Of course, to avoid the formation of cliques, these immigrants of diverse ethnic origins were assigned to different settlements. This resulted in a single colonial settlement in the Congo colony, potentially containing immigrants from multiple different regions. However, because most of these immigrants did not speak the language, and because learning Greek could lead to priority in promotions or rewards, Greek, which was popular among the upper classes, became something these immigrants eagerly sought to learn. The only problem was that it greatly increased the difficulty of the work of the colonial teachers, who could only work together with the missionaries who had come to teach these people the Greek language and script. Chapter 65 Health and Epidemic Prevention. Otto treated the Congo colony as his own territory, sacrificing the indigenous people to reduce the labor burden on immigrants. To even prevent a future wave of colonial independence, Otto prioritized cultural education in the colony, aiming to assimilate these immigrants from all over Europe into Greek culture through its transmission. At the same time, Otto had no intention of leaving any place for the indigenous people in the future Congo, treating them merely as disposable tools. In this respect, it can only be said that all colonizers are equally corrupt. Otto, a modern man in this era, was not much more ethical than these colonizers. The lower Congo River region boasts abundant water resources, fertile land, and a mild climate. Besides agricultural companies establishing large farms there, the Royal Consortium's fishing companies also flourished under Otto's direction. The Congo colony's fishing industry is currently divided into marine fishing and freshwater fishing in the Congo River basin. The fish caught serve as a supplement to the colony's meat supply and will be processed for export to the European market in the future. Mosquitoes in the lower Congo River region, and indeed in much of Central and Southern Africa, are notoriously difficult to find. The year-round temperatures exceeding 20 degrees Celsius make it ideal for mosquito breeding throughout the year. This era plagued European colonists with malaria, dengue fever, and a host of other infectious diseases, all transmitted by mosquitoes, and various viruses were also highly active. Even 2 centuries later, many parts of Central and Southern Africa remain hotspots for malaria and other diseases. Besides the generally low level of medical care in southern African countries, the biggest reason was the rampant mosquito infestation, which even in the 21st century, mosquito nets and incense could not solve the problem. Coupled with the lack of effective treatments at the time, these mosquito-borne diseases taught European colonists a painful lesson. This is also the biggest reason why few European colonists are willing to stay in southern Africa for long. Even the Portuguese, for centuries, only occupied coastal areas and dared not venture inland. For immigrants, besides the local indigenous tribes and wild animals, disease was the greatest threat to their survival. Therefore, Otto consistently emphasized hygiene in the colonies, conducting rigorous hygiene education long before the immigrants arrived. Simultaneously, water sources near the colonies were strictly managed, and any acts of water pollution were strictly prohibited. From the very beginning of the colony's establishment, methods such as burning and burying were used to clear waterlogged areas near surrounding bushes and other suitable breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Many fish, natural predators of mosquito larvae, were also released into the rivers to control the mosquito population. At the same time, Otto also considered the development of therapeutic drugs, especially those effective against malaria. The uses of quinine bark had already been discovered at this time. In 1820, a French pharmacist successfully extracted quinine from cinchona bark and named it cinchona alkaloid. Later, quinine was confirmed to be the effective ingredient against malaria, and thus gained widespread attention. Cinchona bark originates from the Andes Mountains of South America. After the discovery of quinine's effects, the demand for cinchona trees increased dramatically, leading to a high price for quinine. Wild cinchona trees could not meet the demand, so many countries considered transplanting them. However, transplanting is not easy. Cinchona is a very delicate and demanding species. If the environment is unsuitable, even if transplantation is successful, the content of the effective ingredients will be very low. Historically, the British government attempted several times to cultivate cinchona trees, but the resulting plants had low levels of active ingredients and no medicinal value, forcing them to abandon the effort. The Dutch, however, chose Java, a region with a climate similar to the Andes Mountains, and spent 30 years successfully cultivating medicinal cinchona trees. This success allowed the Dutch to control the quinine market for nearly a century, reaping enormous profits. To further secure their profits, the Dutch used strict methods to control the price of cinchona bark. Whenever the international market price dropped, they would destroy some of the cinchona trees. The U.S. Department of Justice sued the Dutch for violating U.S. antitrust laws and confiscated 5 tons of cinchona bark from them in New York, but the Dutch remained unmoved, and the U.S. government was powerless to do anything about it. Envious, the British, unwilling to give up, tried cultivating cinchona in India again. The cultivation was successful, but the content of the active ingredient quinine was too low, making it unrecognized in the international market. The British, left with no other option, chose to produce and sell their products domestically in India, resulting in a steady 2 million deaths from malaria in India each year. There must be suitable places in Africa to grow cinchona, and Otto initially wanted to select suitable locations in Africa to cultivate it, hoping to emulate the Dutch and make a fortune. However, both choosing a suitable planting location and cultivating qualified cinchona trees require time. Otto didn't want to spend 30 years like the Dutch, so he thought of Artemisia annua and the effective drug artemisinin extracted from it. Artemisia annua is a traditional Chinese medicine, mainly produced in China, and distributed throughout the country and coastal areas. It is also found in Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Myanmar, India, and Nepal. Artemisia annua thrives in moist sandy riverbanks, valleys, forest edges, and roadsides. It prefers a warm and humid climate, requires ample sunlight, does not tolerate shade, and dislikes waterlogging. Artemisia annua is not demanding in terms of soil conditions, but it grows well in sunny, fertile, loose, moist, and well-drained sandy and clay loam soils. It can be propagated by seed. Artemisinin, also a highly effective treatment for malaria, was only discovered after World War II. Compared to cinchona bark, Artemisia is clearly more suitable for transplantation. Therefore, when Otto arranged for his fleet to recruit immigrants in the Far East, he also purchased more artemisinin seeds to cultivate in the Congo colony. As for how to use Artemisia to produce artemisinin, research was still needed. Currently, drug extraction is not possible, but simply boiling it and drinking the decoction is believed to have a certain therapeutic effect on malaria, and aside from labor, there are almost no additional costs. The land is readily available, with a suitable environment. Large-scale cultivation is entirely possible. In this way, if Otto had revealed the effects of Artemisia, the value of cinchona bark would have been greatly reduced, and the Dutch probably wouldn't have been able to profit as much as they had historically. However, Otto wouldn't have done so. Even if he created a highly effective medicine using Artemisia, he would have disguised it, going to great lengths to conceal its existence, and would have kept its cultivation and use in the colonies a secret. Because once Europeans knew the value of Artemisia, they would certainly transplant it on a large scale, and transplanting Artemisia is hundreds of times easier than transplanting cinchona. With a relatively inexpensive and effective treatment for malaria, European colonists' desire to colonize southern Africa would have greatly increased, which would have been detrimental to Otto's plans to colonize southern Africa. At this stage, Greece didn't have the resources to compete with powers like Britain and France for colonies. Before the successful transplantation of Artemisia annua, the most effective means of controlling infectious diseases in the Congolese colonies was isolation. Once a problem was detected, individuals were isolated. If they survived, all was well, but if not, the colonies were doomed. At the same time, Otto also demanded that the colonies exercise greater initiative, regularly organizing sanitation and cleaning activities for immigrants, centrally managing garbage and excrement, eliminating mosquito habitats, and preventing the spread of infectious diseases to the greatest extent possible. Otto had been actively involved in these efforts since the beginning of his rule in Bavaria, and after becoming king of Greece, he devoted even greater effort to promoting them within Greece. It's fair to say that agricultural companies were globally leading in their concepts of hygiene and disease prevention. These immigrants might not have been familiar with the concept of hygiene, but after training, they were compelled not to litter, eat indiscriminately, or urinate/defecate indiscriminately. Compared to Greece, which primarily relied on propaganda and encouragement with lenient punishments, the colonies were far more stringent in these areas, with severe penalties for violations. In fact, many in management lacked the necessary understanding, but Otto repeatedly emphasized that these were conclusions reached by European experts. And after they followed these guidelines, the colonies did indeed maintain a low disease incidence rate. Especially compared to the neighboring Portuguese colony of Angola, the effect was remarkable. Therefore, the Congolese colonial administration kept this information in mind and strictly implemented it in the future. Chapter 66 Give the British a little thrill. The war that broke out in Texas at the beginning of the year gave the French an opportunity to return to North America, especially since two prominent figures in French politics, Guizot and Thiers, had reached a rare agreement. Thanks to a friendly reminder from a Parisian newspaper, the French noticed Mexico's financial problems, which they saw as an excellent entry point. During Mexico's war against the Texan separatists, France provided a loan to the Mexican government, intending to use the debt problem to forcibly reclaim Texas when the Mexicans were unable to repay, thus allowing the French to return to North America. This was not impossible, because Mexico was fragmented, struggling to collect taxes, and its annual revenue was less than 20 million pesos, a mess left by Spain. Given Mexico's financial situation, its funds were exhausted just over 3 months into the war, forcing it to accept loans from the French with harsh conditions attached. Meanwhile, the Texan separatists, supported by the United States, were forced to retreat gradually thanks to the military advisors appointed by Otto, but this still bought Mexico considerable time and costed a significant amount of military spending. Seeing that the Texan separatists were on the verge of collapse, the U.S. government finally decided to take direct action, declaring war on Mexico and sending 8,000 troops into Texas. At this point, almost everyone knew that the United States was far more powerful than Mexico, and that Mexico was destined for defeat sooner or later. But Mexican President Santa Anna was not resigned to his fate. While holding firm after defeating the first wave of American troops, he faced a depleted treasury and borrowed again from the French. The French, who had been waiting for this opportunity, were very willing to help Mexico, which was under American pressure. Firstly, for their own benefit, they hoped to seize Texas when Mexico could not repay its debts. Secondly, it stemmed from old grievances between the United States and France. During the American Revolutionary War, the French had fought valiantly for American independence, sending 100,000 troops and a large navy to fight the British. Ultimately, the French suffered 30,000 casualties, a number exceeding that of the American army, demonstrating the immense effort the French had put in. It can be argued that without the strong support of the French, the American Revolutionary War would not have been won, and American independence would likely have been delayed by many years. For this war, France accumulated debts exceeding 1 billion livres and provided substantial loans to the United States, severely straining its national finances and becoming a major contributing factor to the French Revolution of 1789. After the Revolution and the establishment of the First French Republic, the United States refused to repay its debts to France, arguing that the Kingdom of France had ceased to exist and the French Republic had no right to inherit the kingdom's debts. Furthermore, in 1794, the United States reconciled with Great Britain, signing the Treaty of Amity, Commerce and Navigation. Subsequently, the United States ceased supporting France in the Anglo-French conflict, adopting a neutral stance. This naturally angered France, which authorized its civilian ships to attack American vessels and allowed them to sell captured American ships. The United States retaliated by expanding its navy and launching attacks on French ships. For the next 2 years, a series of naval raids erupted, resulting in the capture of hundreds, even thousands, of ships on both sides. Although the war was limited in scale and casualties were relatively few, it completely shattered the once close alliance. Especially during Napoleon's reign, the Americans took advantage of the situation, purchasing Louisiana at an extremely low price, causing France to lose its largest colony in North America. The French held a grudge against the Americans for their treachery and opportunism, and were extremely proactive in causing trouble for the Americans and gaining interests in North America. From the French perspective, Mexico handing over Texas to France would both settle its debts and secure French protection. With France and Texas, it would be difficult for the United States to continue its westward expansion and threaten Mexico, allowing Mexico to rest easy, a win-win situation. The British were also well aware of France's intentions, but they were currently caught in a dilemma. As the filial son of the British Empire, the British naturally did not want to see the United States continue to grow stronger. However, Britain was equally wary of France's return to North America. Given the terms of Texas, France would reap enormous benefits from acquiring it, which Britain did not want to see. Because of this conflicting sentiment, Britain was unable to make a decision for the time being. William IV of England was in poor health at this time, and Victoria in London was ready to assume the British throne at any moment. William IV, now nearing the end of his life, was even more concerned about the transfer of power in Britain after his death. Due to his dissatisfaction with Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, he hoped to hold on for a while longer until Victoria came of age, thus preventing the Duchess of Kent from ruling as Victoria's mother. William IV had little energy left to tend to, let alone international affairs, or even domestic matters. The political turmoil and internal instability during the transition of power were also contributing factors to Britain's inability to make a decision. Otto believed that a little provocation might prompt a quicker decision and further divert Britain's attention. He turned his attention to Spain, where the Civil War had recently ended. On September 29, 1833, King Fernando VI of Spain died. Carlos Maria Isidro, then in Portugal, immediately declared himself King of Spain upon receiving the news and changed his name to Charles V. On the very day Ferdinand VI died, Queen Maria Cristina of Spain declared her daughter, Isabella II, to be on the Spanish throne, with herself as regent. At the same time, Cristina also announced the stripping of Carlos of his princely title and all power, along with the confiscation of his property. Thus began the War of the Spanish Succession, known as the First Cavalry War. From the subsequent actions of both sides, it's clear that compared to the shrewd regent Cristina, Carlos lacked political acumen, his maneuvering alienating many potential supporters and isolating himself. Due to the vast disparity in strength, Carlos's faction initially adopted a guerrilla warfare strategy. This tactic proved highly effective. From 1833 to 1835, Carlos's guerrilla forces not only survived but actually grew in number. Under General Suleiman's command, Carlos's army achieved several brilliant victories, effectively striking at the Spanish government forces. Overconfident, Carlos ignored the significant disparity in strength between the two sides and ordered a large-scale attack on Bilbao. However, under Carlos's personal command, his army was defeated at Bilbao, suffering 20,000 casualties. General Suleiman, a key figure in the army, was killed in action, and Carlos himself was forced to flee with the remaining troops to the mountains on the French-Spanish border. In Otto's view, Carlos was a classic example of someone with little talent but an inflated ego, squandering a winning hand. The truth is, this type of nobleman was never lacking in Europe. Even now, Otto could still think of ways to help Carlos break free from his predicament. In fact, he only needed to marry into the French family to easily gain their support. If he chose an heir, the French would certainly give him their full support. Otto didn't offer advice to Carlos without reason, but he saw an opportunity in it, which made him feel obligated to remind Carlos. Soon, reports began appearing in Parisian newspapers about Carlos's impending marriage to France, indicating that if the marriage between the Burgundy and Orleans dynasties could be achieved, a new and powerful alliance would emerge in Europe. In fact, many French people were quite interested in this. Although Spain was weak at the time, it had a glorious history. France helping Spain regain everything it had lost and integrating it into the French glory would be a major event that could change the entire European landscape. At that time, France would leap to become a powerful country that could rival Britain, and even, over time, its navy would surpass Britain's, making it the new world hegemon. Many political leaders in France were also tempted by this rosy future described in the report. If this could really happen, they would also become figures who shone brightly in French history. Before long, this report in Paris, along with the reactions within the French political circles, quickly reached London, England. Chapter 67 The Reactions of Various Countries. While France was debating whether to form a marriage alliance with Carlos to unite France with Spain, London, England, also reacted strongly to this possibility. British Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne even tore the intelligence report to shreds. "Damn the French, they never stop. What are they trying to do?" Viscount Melbourne shouted. All the French emperors should be exiled to St. Helens. Foreign Secretary Palmerston understood Viscount Melbourne's anger. In fact, he too had felt his blood pressure spike when he received the intelligence report and nearly tore it to shreds. "Is His Majesty aware of this?" Viscount Melbourne asked after a while, having calmed down. "Not yet. You know His Majesty's health. I'm worried he won't be able to handle the shock of this news," Palmerston said in a deep voice. "Why do all these troublesome things have to come at once?" Viscount Melbourne rubbed his forehead, hesitated for a moment, and finally said, "But His Majesty will find out sooner or later." The Parisian newspapers have already reported it, and their counterparts in London will soon be spreading the news everywhere. Even so, we must choose the right time, Palmerston said. Of course I know. Viscount Melbourne nodded. Let's discuss how to deal with this. To be honest, I never imagined that a Spaniard would actually marry a Frenchman. This doesn't seem like something Carlos would do, Palmerston said in a deep voice. Although it's just a newspaper report, news doesn't appear out of thin air. It's very likely that Carlos already has similar ideas in mind. The two sides are probably negotiating. The French government is like a leaky house when it comes to secrecy. It's not uncommon for things under discussion to be reported in the newspapers. The alliance of the Burgundy dynasty caused us a lot of trouble. We can't let France and Spain unite again. It's completely against the interests of the British Empire. Viscount Melbourne said in a deep voice. Even if it's just a possibility, we must prevent it from happening. That's beyond doubt, Palmerston said after a moment of thought. But we can't easily stop it all on our own. The key is to see how the Russians and Austrians react. Besides that, we also need to find a way to completely dissuade the French from this idea. Viscount Melbourne pondered for a moment, then said, I heard the French have provided a large loan to Mexico? Should we choose to help the Americans? Palmerston asked, frowning slightly. At this time, Britain and the United States maintained a facade of peace and had deep economic ties, but relations between the two countries were not good. The border issue between the United States and the British Canadian colonies remained unresolved. 20 years ago, the two sides even fought the Second Anglo-American War over this issue, with the Americans invading the Canadian colonies but being quickly pushed back by the British Army. The British Army even stormed Washington, D.C., and burned the White House to the ground. It's just a gesture. Texas can be used as a bargaining chip in our deal with the French. The specifics will depend on the French themselves, said Viscount Melbourne. I will arrange for diplomatic notes to be sent to the American and French ambassadors, Palmerston agreed without hesitation. The British acted quickly, and soon Nicholas I in St. Petersburg received the information. It seems Carlos has been forced into a corner. Otherwise, given his character, he wouldn't use a marriage alliance as a bargaining chip with the French. However, this isn't exactly good news. Nicholas I frowned upon receiving the message, clearly displeased, even though he had always supported Carlos. Nicholas I was deeply dissatisfied with Regent Christina, refusing to recognize her government in Spain. He not only severed diplomatic ties but also publicly declared that whores and sluts are unfit to lead Spain. This was because Christina's private life was extremely chaotic. Her husband, Ferdinand VI, had just died when she brought her lover to the palace and married him in the presence of a priest. Even on the night of Ferdinand VI's death, she was still with her lover. A scandal that garnered her a large number of opponents in Spain. Christine's actions also greatly angered the extremely conservative Nicholas I. If Spain and Russia weren't so far apart, he probably would have led the Russian army into the Madrid palace and hanged Maria Christine and her lover. However, an alliance between France and Spain was not on the interests of the British, nor was it something Nicholas I wanted to see. If the Franco-Spanish alliance succeeded, France's strength and influence would increase significantly, and continental Europe might once again face the French threat. This reminded Nicholas I of Napoleon's burning of Moscow. Your Majesty, said the Duke of Liubi, a confidant of Nicholas I think the last people who want to see this happen are the British, just like their reaction to the Napoleonic Empire. He then advised, therefore, we don't need to react immediately. During the last French Revolution, Her Majesty Catherine, taking advantage of the preoccupation of Central Europe, annexed Poland. This time, the alliance of France and Spain is a thorn in Britain's side, and we might have the chance to conquer the Ottoman Empire entirely. The Duke of Liubi's reminder immediately opened Nicholas I's mind. That's certainly true. Not only France, but also Austria and the countries of the German regions will not ignore the reappearance of the Napoleonic Empire on the European continent. Then, no one will stop us from taking Constantinople. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the struggle for the interests of this aging empire has become the focus of conflict among the European powers in the 19th century. Located at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Ottoman Empire held a very important strategic position. Its territories in the Balkans, Asia Minor, and North Africa were also of great value. These regions possessed abundant resources such as coal, iron, and cotton, and the four major European powers, Britain, France, Russia, and Austria, all wanted to monopolize these resources. Because of the checks and balances among these powers, the Ottoman Empire was fortunate enough to survive, but it lost vast amounts of territory in the following decades. The Balkan states, with the support of European powers, successively gained independence, becoming subject to their influence and control. This complex international situation, reflected in the Balkans, made the Balkan Peninsula a veritable powder keg. Ultimately, the shooting at Sarajevo ignited World War I, drawing the Ottoman Empire into the conflict, which later became Turkey. Thinking of the potential to monopolize the interests of the Ottoman Empire, Nicholas I felt that a marriage alliance between France and Spain might be a good thing. Imagining Russia's territory annexed by the Ottoman Empire, Nicholas I couldn't help but stand up excitedly and said, "Let the French and British fight like dogs. As long as we annex the Ottoman Empire, we will gain access to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and the British will no longer be able to restrict the great Russian Empire." Chapter 68, Trying to Steal a Chicken but Losing the Rice Instead? Otto's subtle maneuver sparked a new round of open and covert power struggles across Europe. Then, something even more unexpected happened. Queen Regent Christina of Spain, a seasoned political strategist, sensed the danger of this sudden rumor and proactively wrote to King Louis Philippe of France, requesting a marriage alliance. If Carlos's marriage of his eldest son to France would forge an unbreakable alliance between France and Spain, then the marriage of Louis Philippe's son to Isabella II would unite the two nations. Upon receiving the request, Louis Philippe was overjoyed and immediately announced the news. French ministers, who had previously debated the marriage alliance with Carlos, also immediately expressed their support for it. To celebrate this great victory, King Louis Philippe of France held a grand banquet that very day to announce the news. Otto was also extremely surprised upon receiving the news. He had initially thought that the Spanish regent queen would choose to seek help from the English, which would involve both Britain and France in the Spanish Civil War, draining their resources. However, Christina had unexpectedly pulled a decisive move, using the not yet 6-year-old Isabella II as leverage to arrange a marriage with the French, effectively cutting off Carlos's chances of receiving French support. This was somewhat unexpected by Otto, but fortunately, the outcome was roughly as he had planned. Louis Philippe's son was only 12 years old, and Isabella II was only 6, meaning their actual marriage was still a long way off. During this period, Britain could not simply wait for the two countries to unite. Its intervention in the Spanish Civil War became inevitable. When this news spread, Austria and Prussia, unsurprisingly, expressed strong opposition to a possible alliance between France and Spain. However, Otto was surprised by Nicholas I's reaction. Russia did not immediately launch a full-scale attack against the French, but merely expressed lukewarm concern. For a time, almost everyone wanted to understand what the Russians were thinking. Did Nicholas I dislike Christina so much? It wasn't until intelligence reports came that Otto understood what Russia was trying to achieve. Nicholas I began raising funds for the military, while Russian activities in the Balkans and Asia Minor increased significantly, clearly indicating a plan to attack the Ottoman Empire while the Anglo-French conflict raged. This gave Otto a major headache. Had he turned the tables, hoping that conflict between Britain and France over Spain would give Greece an opportunity to exploit the Balkans? However, European politics were interconnected, and the current situation made him feel like his attempt to gain an advantage had backfired. Otto was unsure how to deal with the changing situation in Europe, and only the side of the United States benefiting brought him some relief. At that moment, President Andrew Jackson of the United States looked at the financial statements in his hand, a satisfied smile on his face, and then announced loudly, "Gentlemen, let us remember this great day." In 1836, the United States fiscal revenue reached $61 million, while in 1833 this figure was $21 million. This means that the fiscal problems that have been troubling the United States have been completely solved. As president, he had reason to be happy, but Andrew Jackson, who was not very knowledgeable about finance, did not know that this economic boom caused by the land boom and railroads was actually a time bomb for the United States. He might have vaguely understood that the Second Bank of the United States' continuous printing of paper money was a slow poison for the country, but at this moment, his primary concern was the war with Mexico. Since the United States declared war on Mexico, it had mobilized nearly 30,000 troops, which was the vast majority of the federal government's forces. However, to date, the U.S. military had been unable to quickly eliminate the Mexican troops who were entrenched in their fortifications. especially given the information Andrew Jackson received from the British. He knew that the French were preparing to intervene in the war in Texas, intending to purchase Texas from the Mexicans. If it were just Mexicans, the U.S. Army currently in Texas would be victorious sooner or later. However, the U.S. Army, with only 34,000 men, would be unable to withstand the potential arrival of the French. Therefore, he planned to take advantage of improved finances to massively expand the army in preparation for the Mexican-American War. To ensure a swift victory, Andrew Jackson also planned to use financial incentives to buy off forces within Mexico opposed to Tassinana. It was believed that Tassinana, facing internal and external pressures, would only face defeat. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Bank of New York, Neo, a bank manager dressed like a gentleman, frowned as he looked at the latest monthly report. In the past month, over $2 million had been exchanged for pounds, francs, and gold, but the corresponding inflow was decreasing, significantly reducing the Bank of New York's reserves of precious metals and coins. This wasn't the first time this had happened. If it continued, the Bank of New York might not be able to provide enough gold and coins to exchange for the ever-increasing amounts of dollars next month. Neo frowned. Even one of the largest banks in the United States, the Bank of New York, couldn't withstand this onslaught. He felt this might not be a simple redemption, but rather a run on rival banks. The amount of US dollar banknotes in circulation far exceeded the redemption capacity of all banks in the United States, a secret known throughout the banking industry, and every banker knew the terrible consequences if this secret were exposed. This can't go on. I need to think of something, Neo thought, preparing to convene a meeting of the bank's top management. Otto was naturally involved in the New York bank incident. To avoid attracting attention, he deliberately chose to exchange small amounts in batches at different banks. After all, he knew that he wasn't the only shrewd person, and once his actions were exposed, it could potentially trigger a chain reaction. The real estate crisis in the United States wasn't just about plummeting property prices. Although his memories from his previous life weren't detailed, Otto estimated that the dollar would also depreciate significantly during the economic crisis. Therefore, he needed to exchange his dollars for gold or pounds and francs as quickly as possible. Although Britain was also affected by the U.S. real estate crisis, leading to an economic crisis, the coinage itself has the property of preserving value, and the British, with their vast colonies, are very resilient. To maintain the pound's international status and compete with the franc for monetary hegemony, the British would not allow the pound to depreciate significantly. At the same time, Otto also knew that every economic crisis is a good opportunity to buy at rock-bottom prices, and there were many things in Britain that Otto coveted. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69 I Won't Support Fools. Damn Russians. News of Nicholas I's attitude and plans reached the British, immediately filing Viscount Melbourne with frustration. Although Britain had always maintained a policy of suppressing Russian expansion, it had consistently avoided direct war with Russia. Without the support of other major powers, the British were unwilling to confront Russia alone. Austria and Prussia have both protested to France and Spain, but they both indicated they needed to be cautious about taking concrete measures to stop this marriage. Palmerston replied in a low voice. No matter what, we must stop this damned bitch. Viscount Melbourne couldn't help but shout. The marriage between Carlos's eldest son and the daughter of King Louis Philippe of France had already put the British on edge. If Louis Philippe's son were to marry the Queen of Spain, things would truly be heading towards the worst-case scenario. It seems we have no choice but to support Carlos, but he and his army are currently on French territory. The French could easily deal with him, Palmerston said solemnly. Viscount Melbourne shook his head. Carlos is unreliable. That brainless idiot has turned many of his supporters into his enemies. Past experience tells us that supporting such a fool will only lead to our own ruin. Queen Regent Christina of Spain preferred authoritarianism, but to gain the support of liberals, she adopted a populist facade after coming to power, appointing a liberal leader from a commoner background as prime minister. To win over the nobility and the church, she made numerous promises to high-ranking nobles and Catholic clergy, a series of maneuvers that garnered her a large following within Spain. In contrast, Carlos, seeing the aristocracy and Catholic leaders siding with Christine, immediately accused them of treachery and declared that once he seized power, he would purge liberals from the country. These people were simply testing the waters before choosing sides, a common, unspoken rule in Europe. But Carlos was politically naive, believing himself to be on the side of justice. He inadvertently pushed many potentially gained forces towards the enemy. Great men know to cultivate many friends. Carlos clearly lacked this wisdom, instead isolating himself. After the defeat in the Civil War, Carlos's army was in disarray. What was once a force of 70,000 men had dwindled to a mere 20,000 remnants. When Carlos first fled to the French-Spanish border, the French royalists provided him with considerable assistance. Louis Philippe tacitly allowed the royalists to provide Carlos with money, weapons, and supplies, and even permitted Carlos to employ Frenchmen as mercenaries. To protect Carlos and his men, they allowed them to hide on French territory and refused to allow Spanish government forces to cross the border to pursue them. This support was provided without any return, demonstrating the extent of the French support for Carlos. It was for this reason that Otto promoted a possible marriage between France and Carlos. This was clearly a good opportunity, but Carlos was reluctant, remaining hesitant despite repeated suggestions from his subordinates. Furthermore, with France not yet fully aligned on the matter, and Louis Philippe feeling that a marriage alliance alone wasn't enough to warrant the risk of France facing retaliation from other nations, things dragged on. Then Christine pulled a decisive move, effectively cutting off Carlos's options. It was conceivable that once the marriage was officially confirmed, the French would certainly help the Spanish government forces deal with Carlos and his remaining troops, who were currently hiding deep in the French mountains. From Carlos's actions, Viscount Melbourne realized that Carlos was utterly incompetent and was unwilling to invest too much in him. But we have no other choice, Palmerston said, frowning. It's not without its problems. Fortresses are often breached from within, Viscount Melbourne said meaningfully. I've heard that after Christina and her lover's affair was exposed, many people in Spain have turned against her, especially since she hasn't fulfilled her promises to liberals. Hearing this, Palmerston's eyes lit up. Compared to Carlos, Regent Christina's rule was equally unstable. Especially after her scandal spread, many of her former supporters began to waver. Even if the two were engaged, what if something unexpected happened before the wedding? Your Excellency, please leave this matter to me. A woman of such questionable character as Christina is indeed unsuitable to rule Spain. I will find a more suitable person to govern Spain and guide the Spanish people onto the right path. While the British were taking action, the situation in the Mexican-American War also changed. The French, overjoyed at their marriage alliance with Spain, offered to buy the Texas region from the Mexicans, but this was met with a firm rejection. Meanwhile, the United States reinvaded Austin. Initially, fierce fighting broke out on the northern plains of Austin. The Mexicans were no match for the American forces in direct combat and were forced to retreat, choosing to hold Austin once again. At this time, Mexican General José, with the support of Tassinana's opponents, launched a rebellion and declared himself the interim president of Mexico. Faced with a situation both domestically and internationally, Tassinana had no choice but to accept the French offer to sell the Texas region to France for 80 million francs in exchange for military funds to quell the rebellion. The French army, which had been preparing for some time, entered the Gulf of Mexico, took control of the port of Houston, and took over Austin, which was still under the control of the Mexican government forces. Tassinana then led the Mexican troops in Texas back to Mexico to quell the rebellion. By this time, the Mexican rebels were already close to Mexico City. Having achieved their goal, the French facilitated Tassinana's return home and simultaneously issued an ultimatum to the United States, demanding its withdrawal from all of Texas. However, the Americans were not resigned to this. In December 1836, President Andrew Jackson signed a presidential decree mobilizing the entire army and drawing $10 million from the Second Bank of the United States as reserves for the war against France. However, because Otto had previously exchanged a large sum of money at the Second Bank of the United States, this transaction caused cash flow problems for the bank, forcing them to seek external loans. At this time, many American banks faced similar problems and refused the Second Bank of the United States lending requests. Meanwhile, the American troops, marching confidently to the front lines, were no match for the elite French forces and were utterly defeated. The battlefield setbacks led many Americans to convert their dollars into precious metals or other foreign currencies. Soon after, not only the Second Bank of the United States, But many other American banks also experienced significant shortages of gold and coin reserves. The news sparked panic among the American public, leading to a bank run that engulfed banks, only to have them declare bankruptcy one after another. Suddenly impoverished, Americans rioted, and many banks were looted of their coins, gold, and silver. The impact of the banking collapse quickly spread across the United States. Within a week, New York land prices plummeted by 20%, and Chicago land prices were halved, yet still, no one was willing to buy. Simultaneously, bumper harvests in Europe and America caused crop prices to plummet, with cotton export prices falling by 30% and wheat prices halved. Beset by internal and external troubles, U.S. President Andrew Jackson was forced to sue for peace with the French, recognizing French rule in Texas. The French gained control of the Texas colony and officially announced their return to North America. Chapter 70 Otto's Harvest. The French regained their North American colonies, and by this time, no Americans cared about the Monroe Doctrine anymore. The sudden economic crisis caused the dollar to plummet, and due to the close economic ties between the United States and Britain, it triggered a pound crisis, which also had some impact on other European countries. Of course, due to the conservative economic policies of continental European countries, their economic ties with Britain were not very close, and they were less affected. This economic crisis broke out earlier than previous ones and caused greater damage to the United States. Otto's actions, including the premature withdrawal of large amounts of gold and coins such as pounds sterling and francs, accelerated the outbreak of the crisis. This timing was also remarkably coincidental, falling during France's invasion of North America and the start of the war with the United States. Andrew Jackson originally planned to withdraw all Federal Reserves held in the Second Bank of the United States in 5 installments, and then dismantle the Second Bank. Theoretically, the Second Bank of the United States should have been able to make redemptions 2 to 3 times. However, Otto withdrew a large amount of gold from major American banks in advance. Coupled with his president's actions, this alerted major banks, many of which tightened their redemption policies. Meanwhile, the financial tycoons, business moguls, and government officials who received the news immediately were astute enough to rush to banks to withdraw their funds. This combination of factors, unlike anything in history, prematurely triggered the economic crisis. Large banks could still delay, but small banks were completely unable to resist and were forced to declare bankruptcy. Most banks in this era were private. Once a bank declared bankruptcy, depositors would lose everything. The collapse of small banks triggered a chain reaction, and many large banks, unable to sustain themselves for more than half a month, also declared bankruptcy, making this financial crisis exceptionally severe. Coupled with a defeat in the war against France and heavy military losses, the combined internal and external factors led to a disastrous outcome for the United States. Greece was also affected, with Otto's creditors demanding early repayment from the royal family's financial group. This loan was a payment made by Otto to the Ottoman Empire at the time of the signing of the Treaty of London, as a land purchase payment to peacefully resolve the conflict between Greece and Thessalonians. The loan was primarily disbursed by a British financial group. According to the original agreement, the banks providing the loan could request interest-free repayment of the principal in advance. This was because the American economic crisis affected Britain, plunging the country into trouble. At this time, Britain's domestic economic crisis prevented them from focusing on other matters. They could only try every means to recover funds from around the world. Fortunately, Otto had just profited from this economic crisis, and the Royal Financial Group quickly repaid the remaining principal, averting the crisis of the department store being seized as collateral. Even the British government demanded that Greece repay the remaining loans provided during the War of Independence ahead of schedule, a situation Otto resolved. The government issued a batch of temporary bonds to the royal treasury, obtaining the funds and simultaneously regaining control of its customs jurisdiction. This was a mixed bag for Greece, but overall it benefited. Firstly, many British businessmen who had invested in Greek light industry withdrew their capital, selling off their investments at bargain prices to repatriate funds and salvage their domestic businesses. Otto and Greek capitalists, in turn, bought back these assets at extremely low prices, making a substantial profit. Furthermore, the early removal of British influence from Greek customs significantly weakened British power in Greece. For Otto personally, aside from the early repayment of loans and the funds lent to the Greek government again, His remaining 60% investment had now turned into £8 million in cash and £6,700,000 in gold. £3 million of the gold was placed in the Royal Bank of Greece's reserves, while the remainder was converted into newly minted ramarans. Of the £8 million, £2 million were used to buy up land in the United States at bargain prices, allowing Otto to regain a large amount of American land. The head of the Royal Consortium in North America outlined a bottom fishing plan, anticipating acquiring even more land than previously purchased, all of which would be prime locations. This economic crisis in the United States was more severe than in previous years, impacting not only the real estate market but also the entire economy. This laid a solid foundation for the Royal Consortium's future influence on the American economy. In fact, by the latter half of 1836, before the economic crisis erupted, most speculators had already recognized the bubble, but faced with enormous profits, no one could stop its expansion. Even then, some were still trying to save the U.S. real estate market. Some were unwilling to relinquish their land, hoping to sell when prices rebounded. However, the royal family and financial groups were patient, quietly watching these people fall into despair before buying them at even lower prices. The U.S. government at this time, however, displayed a strong sense of selflessness. Martin Van Buren, who had just replaced Andrew Jackson as president, immediately ordered all banks to refuse to redeem gold and metal coins. This resulted in heavy losses for European investors, primarily British. Of course, some British merchants profited. For example, the British textile industry further lowered purchase prices, causing countless plantation owners to lose everything. The whole of America was in turmoil, and even a large-scale wave of immigration back to Europe began. The United States, with a history of less than a century, already had a weak sense of community. Faced with a crisis, many Europeans who had come to America to escape the frequent wars on the European continent chose to leave. The U.S. military was also strongly provoked. France had shown them the combat power of Europe's top army. Their proud elite troops, with twice the number of French troops, were utterly defeated by the French army, which was ill-equipped and isolated. This greatly shocked the U.S. military, especially considering that the French army, despite its numerical superiority, still chose to take the initiative and achieved a swift victory. The French army's skillful tactics left the U.S. military feeling hopeless. The military proposed increasing military spending, but the new president simply rejected the military's request with the excuse of a lack of funds. Besides the U.S., Otto's bargain hunting in the UK also yielded considerable profits. Before the economic crisis, Otto had been continuously exchanging pounds for gold reserves held in British banks. When the crisis hit, many British banks, due to their close economic ties with the U.S., held large amounts of U.S. dollar banknotes, resulting in significant losses for many. In fact, the British financial sector had repeatedly warned the British government beforehand that there was an excessive amount of US dollar banknotes in the UK, but the huge profits from the textile industry made the British government unwilling to reduce trade with the US. Following the US economic boom, a massive influx of US dollars into London triggered a bank run, leading to the closure or even bankruptcy of many British banks. Otto seized the opportunity, spending £4 million to significantly expand the Greek Royal Bank's operations in London, even acquiring stakes in several established British banks, many of which operated under various fronts. To cope with the bank run, Britain was forced to increase exports in hopes of obtaining more coins. However, European countries, to protect their own economies, raised trade barriers against Britain to prevent dumping. This increased costs for the British textile industry, leading to a decrease in British cotton imports and bankruptcies in American cotton purchasing industries. Greece, on the other hand, seized this opportunity to purchase large quantities of cotton from the United States at below-cost prices, propelling its textile industry into a period of expansion. Chapter 71 Colonial Trade. Looking at the snowflakes of bankruptcy reports before him, Martin Van Buren was utterly devoid of the triumphant air that accompanied him as President of the United States. His eyes were blank, unsure of which way to go. Meanwhile, the Texans readily accepted French rule. The cheers that greeted the French army wherever they went even gave the new governor of Texans a feeling of being transported back to the Napoleonic era. French colonial policy shared some similarities with Otto's. For instance, the French not only learned from the British to plunder wealth and monopolize trade, but also consistently pursued a hardline policy of ethnic assimilation in their colonies. Due to the limitations of the era, The French couldn't invest as much as Otto was willing to, but promoting the French language was still an important task in the colonies. Upon his arrival, the governor of Texas immediately declared that all Texans must send their children to French-established Catholic schools to learn French. For these Americans, who felt little sense of belonging to either America or Mexico, learning French was not a big deal, so they readily agreed. They had reservations about Catholicism, but under the governor's orders, they dared not strongly resist. The first request from these Texans was that the French allow them to continue using enslaved people. Although France had long since banned the slave trade, Europeans were indifferent to the lives of these slaves. Many countries merely made a public announcement, continuing their private practices as before, so the colonial governor tacitly approved. This won the support of the Texans and allowed French rule in Texas to initially stabilize. Because most of the original slaves in Texas had left with the army of Mexican President Santa Anna, much of Texas was now uncultivated due to lack of labor. After some consideration, the governor of Texas distributed captured American prisoners of war to the Texas slave owners at low prices. These Texas slave owners showed no mercy to their compatriots who had fought for their independence, quickly forcing them to work on their plantations. At the same time, these people, at the request of the French, formed the Texas Self-Defense Force, which the French saw as the vanguard for their further expansion in North America and the recapture of former French colonies. Meanwhile, Brooke, one of the leaders of the speculative team Otto sent to America, began peddling cheap African tribal animals from the Congo colony to these Texas plantation owners. Considering the significant losses these former slave owners had suffered during the war, Brooke allowed them to sign an agreement to repay with cotton the following year. This greatly increased Brooke's prestige in Texas, and coupled with his large-scale investment in local plantations, he quickly became one of the leaders of the Texans. Otto allocated the newly acquired funds, with a final £2 million going into the Colonial Development Fund. New Carame, located in the northern region at the mouth of the Congo River, was where over 300 Chinese immigrants from the Far East were settled. In addition to silk and porcelain, Otto's fleet to the Far Eastern Empire also brought back 3,000 Chinese immigrants, who were dispersed to various settlements throughout the Congo colony. To help the Chinese immigrants adapt quickly, New Carame assigned immigrants who had already lived there for some time to guide them in their production and daily life. The guards major in charge of security specifically instructed the locals to treat the newcomers fairly and not to gang up on them. In Otto's plan, the Chinese were treated equally with other immigrants. This was essentially the limit of what Otto could achieve. He couldn't allow them to form cliques, as this would hinder integration, and initial conflicts were almost inevitable. Fortunately, the immigrant communities in these settlements were of diverse backgrounds, and some people gradually learned to accept the Chinese, eventually leading to their complete integration. After all, most of these Chinese came from the lowest rungs of society. As long as the administration remained generally fair, these Chinese, who understood the principle of the people don't fight the officials, were mostly able to adapt to their new lives quickly. There was no need to worry too much about violent conflicts. The Chinese were very patient until they were driven to the brink of despair, second only to the non-resisting Indians. Indians were highly obedient, making them, in this respect, the most desirable ruling group for colonizers. Therefore, the British enjoyed using Indians in their colonies. They were obedient enough and naturally adept at using their power, making them perfect for cooperating with the British in suppressing their colonies. However, the Indians' laziness also caused the British considerable headaches. Otto, understanding this characteristic of Indians, completely rejected the idea of introducing them. The primary threat facing the Congolese colony now comes from the captured natives. A moment of carelessness could lead to casualties among the immigrants. As the Congolese colony expands and the number of captured natives increases, Otto, to ensure security, reinforced the colony with a regiment of guards, bringing the total garrison to 6,000 men. This ensured sufficient manpower to guard existing colonial outposts and to support exploration. For a considerable period, the guards would rotate through the Congolese colony, until the colony's own militia emerged and could undertake some duties, reducing reliance on the guards. Theoretically, the average stay of the guards in the Congolese colonies was about a year, during which their salaries would increase significantly, minimizing the accumulation of negative emotions that could result from prolonged troop deployments. As for the natives, they were never considered part of the Congolese colony's population from the beginning. They were currently considered assets that would increase in value but required continuous use and consumption, or sale. The Congolese colonies had already begun sending some of the more restless natives to North America, particularly Texas, via merchant ships. Brooke was now a well-known middleman in Texas. Not only in Texas, but also in various states of the southern United States, many plantation owners, having heard of Brooke's reputation, purchased high-quality indigenous people from him at low prices. In addition, the Congolese colonies also handed over some indigenous people to the Portuguese, who would then sell these indigenous people to various South American countries, a trade route they had maintained for centuries. The Portuguese were very enthusiastic about this, as the price of the indigenous people provided to them by the Congolese colonies was unexpectedly low, even cheaper than when they purchased slaves from the local indigenous population. Initially, the Portuguese, hearing that the Congolese colony was willing to sell slaves at such low prices, suspected the slaves had some defects. However, after examination, they found that most of the natives were strong and healthy, without any diseases, which reassured them. These natives were transported to South America and were very popular with local plantation owners, each native slave fetching a good price. Now, a major source of income for the Portuguese colony in Angola comes from the importation of native slaves from the Congolese colony. Many Portuguese in the Angolan colony even began to think that having Greeks as neighbors wasn't so bad after all. Chapter 72 Colonial Wars. With the stabilization of the three core colonial outposts, New Nafplio, Sai, and New Carame, planning for a new core colonial outpost began. With the addition of multiple immigrant sources and the experience accumulated from the development of the three core outposts, the Congolese colony quickly decided to establish its fourth core colonial outpost in the Uge region, following established procedures. This time, a new breakthrough was made, the cultivation of maize. Maize has a high yield and is well suited for cultivation in Africa. It was widely grown in Africa in the previous era. Many Chinese immigrants participated in the establishment of the Uge colonial outpost. The newly arrived immigrants used water wheels to draw water from the river into irrigation ditches on the newly developed land. Wang Dashan and other farm laborers were diligently digging the new irrigation canals. He was dark-skinned and thin, but surprisingly strong. He stepped onto a shovel brought from Greece, pulling up loose soil, and with a swift motion, spread the earth onto the edge of the field. "Uncle Lee, you're here early. Tell me, are Greeks easy to get along with?" Wang Dashan asked as he worked. As one of the newly arrived immigrants, Wang Dashan knew little about the Congolese colony and couldn't help but ask his fellow countryman. Li Titan, digging in the dirt nearby, said, "Why ask so many questions? We all have to work hard to earn a living, no matter where we are. Before, we were tenant farmers for landlords in the Qing dynasty, and now we're here working for the Greeks. I heard all this land belongs to the Greek emperor's father. Because there's so much land, and not enough people in Greece to farm it, they hired us to work here. So we came here to farm for the Greek emperor's estate. Back home, we all know each other well, but we don't know the Greek emperor. Aren't we a little worried? What's there to be afraid of? Do you know the Qing emperor? If your village elder hadn't given you a way to make a living, would you have come all this way to farm for the Greek emperor? Stop thinking about these trivial things all day. Did they not feed you? That's true. Land is scarce where we live. Old Master Zhang went to the city to enjoy himself, but he wouldn't lower the rent by a penny. We ran out of food and couldn't survive. I heard that the old man from Greece was recruiting workers, so I signed up and boarded the ship. It was the first time I'd ever seen such a big ship. Life at sea was tough. I was vomiting and had diarrhea for the first few days, and it was a struggle to get here. I didn't expect the treatment at the Greek emperor's estate to be so good. Every meal was provided, but waste was not allowed. Who would want to waste food? Don't worry, the good days are far from over here. Not only will we have plenty to eat every day, but there will also be rewards for good work, including meat. This is even better than celebrating the New Year back home, Li Tian said, reminiscing. If we do well, we can really eat meat? Uncle Lee, you're not kidding me, are you? Wang Dashan's eyes lit up. Why would I lie to you? I've been eating meat for 3 months straight. As long as we're not last, every team in this village gets some. Then we have to work hard. I haven't smelled meat in years, Wang Dashan said, his anticipation growing, and he worked even harder. The other newcomers, listening to their conversation, couldn't help but feel excited, which unconsciously sped up the construction work considerably. Soon, the colony's farm managers discovered that the newly arrived Chinese immigrants were more honest and hard-working, even more so than the European immigrants, which surprised them. In terms of sheer hard work and perseverance, the Chinese were truly admirable. They also understood why Otto had gone to such lengths to bring in Chinese immigrants, and their attitude towards them improved considerably. Meanwhile, just over 100 kilometers away. Fire. Bang bang bang. Second platoon, prepare. A fierce firefight broke out between the 4th Battalion, responsible for garrison patrols and Wedge, and the local tribes. The tribe here numbered in the thousands, dominating the surrounding area with hundreds of warriors. They were far beyond the reach of small white expeditions, and had even wiped out Portuguese expeditions. When the Quengalese colony established its core outpost in Wedge, it alerted the tribe. As the colonial forces established outposts around Wedge, the local tribes, considering the surrounding areas their territory, began preparing to expel these outsiders. Having encountered the Portuguese, the tribal chief, Ruhut, gathered all the tribe's warriors and, with the blessing of the high priest, personally led the tribal army to attack the 4th Battalion's camp. The Wedge region was surrounded by vast plains, and the 4th Battalion's patrols quickly discovered the group's presence and issued a warning. Alerted, the 4th Battalion assembled, and a standoff ensued on the plain. The 4th Battalion's uniforms were all made of textiles, a rare commodity in the eyes of the natives, more valuable than gold. Ruhut viewed the 4th Battalion as prey. Ruhut identified the percussion caps of the guards as the matchlock muskets used by the Portuguese expeditions. While these weapons were incredibly powerful, capable of wounding from a great distance, they were cumbersome to load and required considerable preparation time to fire a single shot. He had seen them used by the Portuguese expeditions before. At Ruhut's command, the warriors of the affiliated tribes, urged on, shouted in a language the 4th Battalion couldn't understand, and charged forward in a swarm. Ruhut, with his tribe's warriors following behind, planned to accelerate and close the distance once the enemy finished their first volley, making it difficult for them to fire a second shot. Because of Ruhut's tribe's warriors following behind, the subordinate tribes had to rush forward quickly. It's said that South African natives are gifted runners, their speed even surprising the guards who underwent daily marching training, so the distance between the two sides quickly closed. Seeing these natives charging forward, the commander of the 4th Battalion smirked. This wasn't the first time he'd witnessed such a native charge. Although the speed of these natives' charge was unexpected, charging a modern army with such a small number of people and such primitive weapons was essentially suicidal. If these natives retreated into the mountains and waged guerrilla warfare, it would certainly be a considerable problem, but in a direct confrontation, even if the enemy outnumbered him by twice, he wouldn't feel any pressure. The commander calmly ordered his men to prepare, aim their guns at the natives, and line them up to be shot in a row. Bang bang bang. As the gunfire rang out, Ruhut couldn't help but quicken his pace. His previous experience fighting the Portuguese had taught him that if he sped up and charged towards these outsiders, the cowardly outsiders would collapse on their own. After the first volley of gunfire, because of the distance, the number of native casualties was not large, but the commander remained calm. Second rank, third rank, prepare. First rank, load. Fire. After 2 more rounds of gunfire, the auxiliary tribal warriors charging at the front suffered heavy casualties. Ruhut shouted, "Don't panic, everyone. The enemy is not far away. As long as we hurry, their weapons will be useless." Many warriors from tribes who had fought against the Portuguese charged even faster at this moment. They knew that they could not hesitate at this time. Only by getting close to the enemy could they find an opportunity, otherwise, they would only suffer a crushing defeat. The commander of the 4th Battalion, watching the increasingly rapid advance of the native warriors behind him, calmly ordered, "First platoon, advance and fire." Because of the close proximity, the results were excellent. Over 50 natives fell. Realizing the 4th Battalion's reloading speed exceeded their expectations, some cowardly enemy soldiers began to try to escape. The 4th Battalion wouldn't give them a chance. The commander ordered again, "Second platoon, fire. Third platoon, prepare. The rest of you, fix bayonets." In the next 2 rounds of attacks, the natives suffered over 100 casualties, a huge loss for the Ruhut tribe, which only had a few hundred warriors. Before even encountering the enemy, they had already lost a fifth of their forces. Comrades beside them fell one by one, and the morale of these tribal warriors collapsed. The entire unit descended into chaos, and everyone scattered and fled. Pursuit. Seeing this, The commander of the 4th Battalion drew his sword and led the charge. The already disorganized tribal tribe was relentlessly pursued by the 4th Battalion soldiers. By dusk, when the battlefield was cleared, the tribal forces had suffered over 500 casualties and 131 prisoners, including their chief, Reshaped. The 4th Battalion continued its proactive attack on this tribal tribe that had dared to provoke them, advancing on their tribal stronghold. However, due to insufficient numbers, they did not choose to attack from all sides, but instead open up the inland direction, giving them hope of escape while capturing as many natives as possible who could not escape in time. Chapter 73 Leisure Chess. In 21st century Greece, the three main pillars of its foreign exchange earnings are tourism, remittances from overseas Chinese, and maritime transport. In this era, if not for Otto, the only other noteworthy aspect of Greece would likely be its maritime industry. Greece is an island, jutting into the Mediterranean Sea at the tip of the Balkan Peninsula, with a long and winding coastline. The Greek coast boasts many deep-water ports. Due to the poor soil of Greece, many Greeks have relied on sailors for their livelihood since ancient times. Therefore, the Greeks are very enthusiastic about maritime trade, and even when Athens was still a city-state, it was already a renowned commercial port city on the Mediterranean. Tourism in Greece is still largely undeveloped, but it allows visitors to experience more pristine and beautiful scenery. Otto, having finally found some free time for a vacation, ultimately chose Corfu, an island located between the Apennine Peninsula and Greece. Having been ruled by the Venetian Republic, the island boasts many Italian-style buildings and beautiful scenery, making it a truly relaxing place. Upon arriving in Corfu, Otto stayed at a manor that originally belonged to one of the members of the Greek National Council. These members were executed by Otto, their land ownership was revoked, and their assets were sold by the Greek government to raise funds for the new government. This manor was purchased by Vester in a government auction, and after some renovations, it became Otto's residence. At the time, Otto didn't get a good deal. As dusk fell, standing on the balcony of the third floor of the manor, watching the sunset, Otto's mood unconsciously relaxed considerably amidst the beautiful scenery. Before he knew it, it was 1837, and the changing international situation felt somewhat beyond Otto's control. At this time, he was unaware of the British's secret schemes. Britain had issued a stern warning about the French-Spanish marriage, arguing it would pose a serious threat to the stability of continental Europe, and had also provided some aid to Carlos. However, Britain made no attempt to obstruct France's acquisition of the Texas colony, and its aid to Carlos seemed rather lukewarm. After his defeat in the Spanish Civil War, Juan Carlos fled to the mountains on the French-Spanish border. Previously, France had consistently prevented Spanish forces from crossing the border to pursue Carlos and his army, and had provided them with supplies. However, after the engagement of Louis Philippe's son to Isabella II, France ceased its aid to Carlos and opened the border to the Spanish army, allowing them to attack Carlos's forces hidden in the mountains. Otto had initially guessed that Britain would do everything in its power to help Carlos seize the Spanish throne, thus derailing the Franco-Spanish marriage. However, Britain only provided Carlos with a batch of supplies and weapons, and then took no further action, as if it were a routine matter, showing no particular urgency. This was nothing like the reaction Britain should have. Was Britain just going to sit idly by and watch France unify Spain, threatening its security, and hand over its global hegemony? Since you're here on vacation, don't think about those troubling things. Natasha's soft voice came from behind Otto. I don't think His Majesty Ludwig I was as busy and worried as you. Shaking his head, Otto thought to himself. My father lacks ambition, he only cares about art and beautiful women every day. That's certainly less stressful, but what's the point of living like that for a lifetime? He turned and hugged Natasha, putting aside his worries, and chatted with her as they watched the sunset. He didn't tell Natasha that some time ago, he had arranged for his intelligence agents to contact members of the Polish reconnaissance army in Vienna. Although Natasha's parents had some contact with the Polish reconnaissance army, Natasha had refused to talk about the past since leaving Poland, and even less willing to have contact with her parents' friends. Otto found it interesting that the Polish reconnaissance army had so openly established a base in Vienna, making it almost common knowledge, yet the Austrian secret police hadn't wiped them out. Austria was also part of the partition of Poland, and he couldn't understand why they would establish a base in the enemy's stronghold without any covert organization. Was they simply too afraid to die? Poland, in later generations, was jokingly referred to online as a country adept at giving away its spoils, and the root cause of this was its extreme democracy. Poland's elective monarchy system turned the country into a disorganized mess, thus destroying the once powerful Kingdom of Poland that had easily defeated its neighbors. The performance of these Polish restoration troops made Otto hesitate about contacting them. Fortunately, he didn't expect them to succeed, he only wanted them to be useful when needed. According to intelligence, these men had performed quite well in the previous Polish uprising, and their rebel army initially achieved successive victories, at one point defeating 30,000 Russian troops. However, these victories were insufficient to bridge the vast gap between Poland and Russia. Nicholas I, a determined man, quickly increased his forces, sending in 50,000 if 30,000 wasn't enough, and then 100,000, and soon dispatched another army to attack Warsaw. The Russian army besieged the Polish rebels within the city of Warsaw, pushing the Polish soldiers to the brink of starvation and exhaustion, while the Russian army continued to grow in number. Meanwhile, Prussia, fearing the expanding influence of the Polish uprising, signed an agreement with Russia, providing them with favorable conditions for the Russian army. At the same time, Russia also deployed troops to blockade the Polish border, confiscated the Polish insurgents' weapons, and arrested thousands of volunteers preparing to go to Warsaw to fight against Russia. While Britain verbally expressed support for Poland and offered to sell weapons and ammunition, it required payment in cash up front. King Louis Philippe of France, though sympathetic to the Polish people, quickly sent envoys to Russia, indicating his commitment to the terms of the Vienna Conference in response to Russian warnings. Only Austria, hoping to weaken Russia and prevent it from focusing its advance into the Balkans, offered some assistance, selling weapons, food, and medicine to the Polish people and volunteers, along with military training. A large number of armed men entered Poland from Austria, but after Poland's defeat, many fled into Austria, contributing to the ongoing unrest in Galicia. This failure also plunged the Polish independence movement into a low point. Otto, through intelligence agents, contacted the Polish Reconquista and provided a batch of obsolete guards weapons. To avoid detection, Otto used a British name. The weapons were of the same type as those used by the British Army, and such transactions were commonplace, so he wasn't worried about being implicated. For him, it was a strategic move. Whether it would prove effective remained to be seen. Chapter 74 New Teachers at the University of Athens. Since its founding, the University of Athens has had a tradition of recruiting teachers from various European countries. Higher education in Greece started late, and there is a shortage of domestic talent. Therefore, most of the science and engineering faculty at the University of Athens are recruited from outside. These faculty members, who are already well known at universities across Europe, are not easy to hire. The University of Athens offers very generous salaries, but most of the time, it can only recruit young teachers or teaching assistants. However, this time, the University of Athens' new list of recruited faculty members includes a name that greatly surprised Otto: Christian Double. This man was a figure who influenced the course of human scientific development. His discoveries only began to be gradually understood and revealed to people decades later. Otto only knew the color Doppler ultrasound, radar, and even the theoretical foundation of the Big Bang were based on his discoveries. If he hadn't seen the relevant information about him, Otto wouldn't have known that he had been unable to find work, was impoverished, and almost lost his family. Tupolev was born in Salzburg, Austria, into a family of stonemasons for generations. As the eldest son, he was supposed to take over the family business, but he was naturally weak and unable to do so. Because of his interest in mathematics, Tupolev entered the Technical College of Vienna in 1822, and 3 years later, he entered the University of Vienna, where he earned several degrees. He then found a teaching assistant job at the University of Vienna, but the university did not renew his contract when it expired. After several unsuccessful job applications, he had to leave Vienna and return to his hometown, where he found a job as an accountant in a textile factory. His brother, learning of his situation, offered to sponsor his trip to the United States and gave him a large sum of money. However, at this time, he received an invitation from a high school in Prague to become a teacher. Unwilling to travel overseas, he chose to stay, settled in Prague, and married the daughter of a local goldsmith. But their married life was unhappy. The goldsmith's daughter quickly spent all his money and often abandoned him and their daughter at home, returning to her parents' home alone. In a fit of anger, Debler took his daughter and returned to Vienna to seek work again. He contacted several universities in Vienna but was repeatedly rejected. His money was almost gone, and his daughter developed a high fever. Fortunately, he noticed a job posting on the wall of the University of Vienna. The University of Athens was recruiting faculty. He contacted the University of Athens staff in Vienna. Although his work experience wasn't particularly impressive, his multiple degrees led the University of Athens staff to arrange an interview for him, provide travel expenses, find a doctor for his daughter, and pay for her medical bills. Actually, the little girl wasn't sick, she was just extremely hungry, and due to her rapid metabolism, her blood sugar dropped, causing palpitations, sweating, and fever. After confirming that his daughter was alright, Dupol finally breathed a sigh of relief and experienced the long-awaited feeling of having a full meal. Filled with anticipation and a touch of trepidation, Dupol brought his daughter to Athens, successfully passed the interview, and became a teacher at the University of Athens, responsible for teaching mathematics. After 2 months in Athens, he had completely fallen in love with this beautiful and clean city. The air was fresh, the wide streets were lined with green plants, and the Greeks living there held him, a university teacher, in high esteem, providing him with numerous conveniences whenever possible. Recently, all of Athens has been bustling with activity, cleaning the streets and decorating. He learned from his colleagues that this was because Greece was about to move its capital to Athens, and King Otto would be holding celebrations there. Before coming to Athens, he already knew the Greek king's name, because the king was from Bavaria. Dubler felt a natural affinity for him, as they were both from the Greater German region. Then he made some surprising discoveries. Otto enjoyed extremely high prestige among the Greeks. Even the freedom-loving Greeks were willing to accept his autocratic rule. It's worth noting that in many European countries today, people have held demonstrations to fight for electoral systems. But in Greece, the birthplace of democracy, the Greeks' extreme devotion to their autocratic king was somewhat peculiar to him. However, considering what the Greeks often boasted about, King Otto's reclaiming of Thessaly and the abolition of poll taxes and other exorbitant levies after taking the throne, and his even more remarkable feat of reasoning and persuasion with the British to reclaim the Ionian Islands, any one of these achievements certainly earned Otto the Greek support. His teaching work at the University of Athens was more demanding than his previous teaching assistant job. The student schedules were packed, and the teacher's workload naturally increased as well. Dubler adapted relatively well. The generous salary allowed him and his daughter to live a comfortable life, and he could even afford to hire a Serbian maid to take care of her. No longer needing to worry about money, he enjoyed visiting the King's Library at the University of Athens in his spare time, in addition to his daily work. The library's collection was extremely rich, even comparable to that of the University of Vienna, and he had heard that all the books were donated by King Otto after collecting them from around the world. Many of these books were brand new scientific works, which he found very appealing, becoming a regular visitor to the library and giving him time to ponder and verify some ideas that had always been in his heart. Then he noticed the Royal Research Fund at the University of Athens, supposedly established by the Royal Foundation. If a research project was approved, it would receive financial support from the Royal Foundation. Dubol wrote an application, but unfortunately, it was rejected because the reviewers felt it was too absurd and lacked practical value. Therefore, he had to conduct the research on his own. Fortunately, his previous experiences had made him accustomed to rejection, and he was only somewhat disappointed by the result. After some thought, he decided to conduct the research himself. The initial theoretical work didn't require much funding, and it wasn't a burden for him at that time. To his surprise, not long after his application was rejected, news came that it had been approved. Apparently, a prominent figure at the King's Research Foundation was very interested in his project and approved his application. Upon receiving the news, Dubler wanted to find out who the person was and wanted to personally visit and express his gratitude. However, the people at the King's Research Foundation said that the important figure didn't care about such trivial matters. He only hoped that Dubler could focus on his research, and that achieving results would be the best reward for him. Chapter 75 New Type of Rifle. After the French stabilized Texas, the Mexican Civil War continued. General José, representing the South, instigated a rebellion in Mexico at a critical juncture in the war. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the French reneged on the payment, claiming that the remaining balance of the purchase price for Texas would only be given to the true rulers of Mexico. As a result, the French acquired the entirety of Texas with only a 30 million franc down payment. Mexican President Tassin Anna could only rage helplessly, as the domestic rebellion was still unsettled, and he couldn't afford to offend France. In terms of strength, Tassin Anna's government forces actually held a significant advantage. Shortly after returning to Mexico, they swept through the country, recapturing Mexico City with unstoppable momentum. However, the tide of battle turned. The rebels, seemingly possessing a godlike perspective, anticipated every move Tassin Anna made, and all of his troop movements were anticipated by the rebels, inflicting considerable losses on the Mexican government forces. But this wasn't enough to bridge the gap. The Mexican government forces still held a substantial advantage. Then, at this crucial moment, the Mexican Navy suddenly defected, blocking Mexico's sea lanes and supplying the rebels with large quantities of supplies and equipment. This put Tassin Anna's Mexican government forces in a completely unfavorable position. Tassin Anna realized the insurgents' unusual behavior was suspicious. After investigation, he discovered a traitor within his own ranks and learned that it was all an American conspiracy. The Americans had orchestrated the rebellion, turned the Mexican Navy against them, and profited immensely from the Mexican Civil War, recovering their losses during the economic crisis. Tassin Anna was naturally unwilling to accept this. He continued fighting the rebels while appealing to Europe for help. However, Britain and France both refused his requests, as a powerful Mexico was not in their interest. As Spain was still embroiled in its civil war, Austria had no interests in North America and no intention of offending Britain, France, and the United States, so it chose to turn a blind eye. Having just moved its capital to Athens, Otto received the latest news from Mexico. Britain, France, and the United States did not want the Mexican rebellion to be quelled quickly, but for Otto, a stronger Mexico would be more likely to tie down American resources and slow down American development. This was in itself an interest. Tassin Anna's biggest problem was the inability to purchase military supplies, and logistical resources were also scarce. These were not problems for Otto. Although Mexico's sea lanes were blocked by the rebellious navy, Greece could not openly supply Mexico to avoid attracting the attention of Britain, France, and the United States. Even before the Mexican-American War, Otto had stockpiled a batch of weapons in Mexico, intending to sell them to the Mexicans if Mexico suffered heavy losses in the fighting in Texas. However, Tassin Anna's timeline took a dramatic turn, achieving victories in Texas and forcing the Americans to intervene. It wasn't until the Americans instigated a rebellion behind Mexican lines that Mexico was forced to sell Texas to the French. This batch of weapons, totaling 50,000 rifles and 2 million rounds of ammunition, nearly half second-hand, remained hidden in Otto's warehouse in Mexico. More than 6 months earlier, Otto, who had made his first profit from investments in the United States, had invested in vast farms in California. At that time, California was still Mexican territory. Due to its sparse population, land was extremely cheap, and Otto easily acquired large tracts of land through a combination of purchase and occupation. Otto's investment there was primarily for the gold mines. San Francisco was far too famous. He first secured the surrounding land, then sent prospecting teams to confirm the specifics of the gold mines, and finally arranged for people to secretly mine them. At this time, California was sparsely populated, with only about 100,000 Mexicans and some Native American tribes. To keep the gold mining secret for at least 3 to 5 years, the key was to have enough manpower. After acquiring the land surrounding the gold mines, the Royal Consortium spent a large sum of money to bring in tens of thousands of immigrants from the Far Eastern Empire and imported a large amount of supplies from Europe. Their plan was to first establish these farms to better drive out other residents from the mining area. When the first batch of food was planted, the farms were short-staffed due to the distance and the fact that Chinese laborers had not yet arrived. The agricultural company's workers used a broad-based planting method, unable to cultivate the land intensively, resulting in a small harvest. However, this food was enough to keep the Mexican government troops from starving for a short period. Of course, Otto wasn't doing charity. Tassin Anna also paid, and for the shortfall, Tassin Anna used a silver mine belonging to a rebel family as collateral. Arms dealing is inherently a highly profitable business, and although the silver mine hadn't been acquired yet, the cash paid by the Mexicans was enough for Otto to break even. Since its inception, Otto's arms factory had been operating at full capacity, primarily for internal use. Arms deals with Mexico were among the few export orders the factory received. While ensuring production, the factory also continuously researched new rifles. Last year, Intelligence personnel from the Royal Consortium received information that Dresser had completed the design of a rear-loading needle-fired rifle. Before this, muzzle-loading rifles were the mainstream, and breech-loading rifles were considered a very rebellious design. Some military generals even felt that breech-loading rifles were not elegant enough, and thus mocked, "Noble people should eat with their mouths, not their buttocks," and the same goes for guns. In fact, breech-loading rifles were not adopted by various countries mainly because they were too expensive, and current breech-loading rifles generally lacked sufficient gas tightness, had too many hidden dangers, insufficient thrust, and were extremely cumbersome to maintain. However, Otto, who knew the future trend, had his intelligence personnel pay close attention to news related to breech-loading rifles. After this new needle-fired rifle design appeared, he immediately had the relevant patent technology data purchased and brought back to Greece. Following this, the arms factory began developing a new breech-loading rifle. Unfortunately, they were unable to bring Dresser to Greece to participate in further research. Otto was somewhat relieved, however, because shortly after the Royal Consortium acquired the relevant patents, the Prussian government also recognized the rifle's superiority. They took over everything, classified the technology, and assembled a team for further research. Meanwhile, Prussian intelligence agents learned that Greece had also purchased the relevant patents. Fortunately, the Prussians didn't think much of Greece, believing it lacked scientific research capabilities, and the intelligence officer in charge simply ignored the news. In fact, the military factories had been researching breech-loading rifles for a long time. This invention can be said to have completed a crucial piece of the puzzle, greatly accelerating the research speed of breech-loading rifles in Greece. Until the beginning of this year, the latest product from the military factories passed testing, and Otto immediately ordered that this rifle be named the Type 37 rifle. He planned to phase out the muzzle-loading rifles in the Greek army within the next 2 to 3 years, replacing them with a new breech-loading rifle. As for the phased-out rifles, they were either used for Greek reserve training or sent to various farms in the Balkans as self-defense weapons. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.